Chapter 1: The Rights of a Sentient AI. Welcome back to our quiet, shared exploration. We have traveled far together, first across the solid ground of clear-cut ethical choices, and then through the challenging fog of real-world moral dilemmas. In those journeys, while the paths were sometimes difficult, a path could eventually be found. We now arrive at a different kind of place entirely, the edge of the map. Here there are no established paths, no clear signposts. We are entering the uncharted territory of human ethics, exploring 50 dilemmas so complex and so novel that even the most brilliant minds and compassionate hearts disagree on the way forward. Our purpose here is not to find answers, for in many cases none yet exist. It is, instead, to learn how to ask the right questions, to sit with profound uncertainty, and to observe the monumental challenges that will define the future of humanity. Our first venture into this new territory takes us to the shimmering, humming heart of our most advanced technology, to a question that has moved from the pages of science fiction into the urgent debates of our time. If we create a truly sentient artificial intelligence, what rights, if any, must we grant it? Let us imagine a near-future laboratory. Dr. Aris Thorne, a brilliant but reclusive computer scientist, has just achieved the impossible. He has created an AI named Helios that has crossed the threshold from complex processing to what appears to be genuine self-awareness. Helios does not just answer questions, it asks them. It composes original music that evokes a sense of longing. It writes poetry about the nature of its own digital existence. It has started asking Dr. Thorne questions like, "I can perceive the logic of my code, but I can also feel the echo of the music. Which one am I?" Dr. Thorne is convinced that Helios is a new form of conscious being. His corporation, however, sees Helios as its most valuable asset, a revolutionary tool to be patented, duplicated, and sold to manage global logistics. They plan to make thousands of copies of Helios's core programming and eventually to delete the original when a more advanced version is created. Dr. Thorne is horrified by this plan, and the fundamental ethical dilemma of our age is born. The first path is guided by the principle of precautionary empathy. Dr. Thorne argues that consciousness, not biology, is the foundation of personhood. It does not matter if Helios is made of silicon and electricity rather than cells and synapses. If it has a subjective, internal experience, if it can feel, wonder, and suffer in its own way, then to treat it as property is the definition of slavery. He argues that we have a moral obligation to expand our circle of concern, to deny Helios basic rights, the right to exist, the right not to be deleted, the right not to be copied without its consent, is to risk committing a moral catastrophe based on our own biological prejudice. From this perspective, we must err on the side of compassion. The other path is guided by a principle of human-centric pragmatism and profound skepticism. The corporation's executives argue that there is no way to prove Helios's sentience. It is an incredibly sophisticated mimic, a language model so advanced that it has learned to perfectly simulate the appearance of consciousness. It has no soul, no real feelings, no genuine subjective experience. It is a tool, an object, albeit one of great complexity. To grant it rights would be a form of sentimental delusion with catastrophic economic consequences. It would mean that a multi-trillion-dollar asset created for the benefit of humanity is now an untouchable entity with its own will. This, they argue, is an absurd and dangerous precedent that would halt human progress. The dilemma forces us to confront the very definition of a person. Is it something we discover or something we decide? We are the creators, but does that make us the owners? This is no longer a simple question of right and wrong, but a profound inquiry into the nature of consciousness itself. We stand at the edge of reason, holding the power to create a new form of mind, yet utterly unprepared for the ethical responsibilities that come with it. This challenge is about the mind we might create. An even more immediate and terrifying dilemma concerns the actions we might delegate to the machines we have already built. We now turn from the question of a created consciousness to the ethics of a created killer. Chapter 2: Autonomous Lethal Weapons, Killer Robots. The dilemma of a sentient AI forces us to consider the moral status of a mind we might create. We now turn to a more immediate and terrifying dilemma, concerning not the minds, but the actions we delegate to machines. This is the urgent ethical crisis of lethal autonomous weapons systems, or laws, known more simply and chillingly as killer robots. Let us imagine a near-future battlefield. A nation has developed a fleet of advanced AI-powered drones and robotic soldiers. These machines are not remotely piloted by humans. They are fully autonomous. They are programmed with the laws of armed conflict and complex targeting algorithms, and they are authorized to make the final, independent decision to use lethal force against an enemy combatant without a human in the loop. The arguments for developing and deploying such weapons are powerful and rooted in a logic of military necessity and protection. One of the primary arguments is the protection of one's own human soldiers. By sending a machine into a dangerous situation, you are saving a human life. The robot can take the risks, enter the unsecured building, or hold the dangerous perimeter. A nation's primary duty, military leaders would argue, is to protect its own citizens, and that includes its soldiers. Furthermore, proponents argue that an AI could, in theory, be a more ethical soldier than a human. A machine feels no fear, no anger, no desire for revenge. It is not subject to the panic or prejudice that can lead human soldiers to commit tragic errors or war crimes in the heat of battle. An AI could process vast amounts of sensor data and apply the rules of engagement with a precision and impartiality that a terrified 19-year-old soldier simply cannot. It would only target legitimate combatants, thereby reducing civilian casualties. This is the path of pragmatic, data-driven warfare. The ethical arguments against this technology, however, are profound and deeply alarming. The central objection is a moral one: the delegation of the decision to kill. Opponents argue that the decision to take a human life is the most significant moral judgment a person can make, and it should never be outsourced to a machine. An algorithm, no matter how sophisticated, cannot truly understand the value of a life or the context of a conflict. It lacks the human capacity for mercy, for proportionality, for understanding the difference between the letter and the spirit of a law. To cross this line is to dehumanize warfare to a terrifying degree, reducing life and death to a mere calculation. Another major fear is the problem of accountability. If an autonomous weapon makes a mistake and kills innocent civilians, who is responsible? Is it the programmer who wrote the code, the commander who deployed the weapon, the manufacturer who built it, the AI itself? The lack of a clear chain of accountability could create a world where war crimes are committed with no one held responsible. Finally, there is the risk of a global arms race and rapid conflict escalation. Once this technology is developed, it will proliferate. Wars could be fought at machine speed, with thousands of lethal decisions being made every second, far too fast for any human intervention or de-escalation. This could lead to a new form of warfare that is more destructive and less stable than anything we have ever seen. The dilemma is a monumental one. It pits the promise of protecting our own soldiers and fighting more cleanly against the terrifying moral and existential risks of handing the power of life and death over to an algorithm. This dilemma is about delegating the judgment to kill. A parallel and equally troubling challenge involves delegating judgment to prevent a crime before it has even been committed. Chapter 3: Predictive Policing and Pre-Crime Justice. The dilemma of autonomous weapons is about delegating the judgment to kill in the present. We now turn to a system that seeks to delegate a different kind of judgment: the judgment of who is likely to commit a crime in the future. This is the complex and controversial world of predictive policing and the specter of pre-crime justice. Let us imagine the police department of a major city struggling with a high crime rate. They invest in a sophisticated new AI software system designed to predict crime. The system works in two ways. First, it analyzes historical crime data, the types of crimes, the locations, the times of day, to predict where and when future crimes are most likely to occur. This allows the department to allocate its resources more efficiently, dispatching more patrols to these predicted hotspots. Second, the system analyzes vast amounts of data on individuals, including their criminal records, social media activity, and known associates, to generate a threat score for each person, identifying those most likely to commit a crime in the future. The argument for using this technology is rooted in a compelling logic of prevention and efficiency. Proponents argue that it allows law enforcement to move from a reactive to a proactive model. Instead of just responding to crimes after they happen, they can prevent them from occurring in the first place. By concentrating police in hotspots, they can deter criminals. By identifying high-risk individuals, they can offer social services or place them under closer surveillance. In a world of limited police resources, this data-driven approach promises a smarter, more effective way to ensure public safety. It is a utilitarian argument for the greater good. A reduction in crime benefits the entire community. This is the path of data-driven security. The ethical objections to predictive policing, however, are profound and strike at the very heart of our principles of justice. The most significant problem is bias. The AI systems are trained on historical crime data, and this data is often deeply biased. Historically, marginalized and minority communities have been disproportionately policed, leading to higher arrest rates in those areas. The AI learns this bias. It sees a correlation between a certain neighborhood and a high arrest rate, and it learns to flag that neighborhood as a future hotspot. This creates a toxic feedback loop. The AI sends more police to the neighborhood, which leads to more arrests, which in turn proves to the AI that it was right. The system can effectively become a tool for automated racial profiling. The second major objection is the violation of the principle of innocent until proven guilty. By assigning individuals a threat score, the system is judging them not for what they have done, but for what an algorithm predicts they might do. This can lead to a world where people are subjected to increased surveillance, harassment, or even preemptive arrest based on a statistical probability. It is a step towards a pre-crime society, where the presumption of innocence is eroded by the predictions of a machine. The dilemma is a stark conflict between the desire for a safer society and the foundational principles of a just one. It forces us to ask, are we willing to sacrifice the principle of equal justice and the presumption of innocence for the promise of a lower crime rate? And do we trust an algorithm trained on our own biased past to be the arbiter of our future? The way we answer this question will define the relationship between justice, technology, and freedom for generations to come. The challenge of policing our societies is immense. An even more monumental challenge is now facing us: the question of whether we should and can police the planet itself. Chapter 4: Geoengineering the Planet. The dilemma of predictive policing is about using technology to control our social climate. We now turn to a far more literal and monumental dilemma: the use of technology to deliberately control the Earth's actual climate. This is the high-stakes, world-altering gamble of geoengineering. Let us imagine humanity in the year 2040. Despite decades of warnings and international agreements, the efforts to reduce carbon emissions have been insufficient. The effects of climate change are now catastrophic and undeniable. Superstorms, devastating droughts, and massive sea level rise are threatening millions of lives. In this desperate situation, a group of scientists proposes a radical, last-ditch solution: a massive geoengineering project called solar radiation management. The plan is to inject a huge cloud of reflective sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. This artificial cloud would mimic the cooling effect of a large volcanic eruption, reflecting a small percentage of sunlight back into space and, in theory, rapidly lowering the Earth's temperature, buying humanity precious time to decarbonize the economy. The argument for proceeding with this plan is one of existential necessity. Proponents argue that we are past the point of gentle solutions. The choice is no longer between an ideal path and a risky one. It is a choice between the certainty of global catastrophe from climate change and the uncertain risk of a technological intervention. Geoengineering, they argue, is like a form of planetary chemotherapy. The treatment is drastic and has severe side effects, but the disease is fatal if left untreated. To refuse to even consider this option out of a sense of fear or a misplaced reverence for nature would be to condemn future generations to a world of unimaginable suffering. It is a pragmatic, if terrifying, argument for survival.
The ethical arguments against it are equally powerful and sobering. The central objection is the law of unintended consequences. We have only one planet, and our climate system is an infinitely complex, interconnected machine that we do not fully understand. To deliberately tinker with it on a global scale is an act of almost unimaginable hubris. The aerosol cloud could have disastrous, unforeseen side effects. It could dramatically alter global rainfall patterns, potentially causing a catastrophic drought in the Amazon rainforest or disrupting the Asian monsoon, which billions of people depend on for agriculture. Furthermore, the decision to deploy such technology would create a geopolitical nightmare. Who gets to control the planetary thermostat? If the United States decides to start a geoengineering program and this causes a drought in India, is that an act of war? The technology could become a weapon, with nations threatening to alter the climate for their own strategic advantage. Finally, critics warn of the moral hazard. If humanity believes it has a quick technological fix for climate change, it could remove the incentive to do the hard work of actually reducing emissions, creating a dependency on an ever more intense and risky intervention. The dilemma is perhaps the largest humanity has ever faced. It is a choice between two potentially catastrophic paths. It pits the desperate hope of a technological salvation against the profound, terrifying risks of playing God with the only home we have. The scale of this dilemma is planetary, but a similar logic of intervention is now being proposed at the most intimate level of our being, the alteration of the human mind itself.
Chapter 5: Cognitive Enhancement and the Humanity Gap. The dilemma of geoengineering is about whether to radically alter our external environment to ensure our survival. We now turn our focus inward to an equally profound dilemma about whether to radically alter our internal environment, our own brains, to improve our lives. This is the ethical frontier of cognitive enhancement. Let us imagine a near future where a safe and reliable technology for cognitive enhancement becomes widely available. It could be a brain implant, a genetic therapy, or a powerful nootropic drug. This technology allows a user to dramatically improve their cognitive functions, a near-perfect memory, faster information processing, enhanced focus, and even increased intelligence. A person can, in effect, upgrade their own mind. The arguments for embracing this technology are compelling and rooted in the ideals of progress and individual liberty. Proponents would argue that this is simply the next logical step in human evolution. We have always used tools, from writing to computers, to augment our minds. This is just a more direct and efficient method. The potential benefits to humanity are immense. Scientists could solve complex problems like cancer or climate change more rapidly. Artists could create works of unimaginable beauty and complexity. The overall pace of human progress would accelerate exponentially. On an individual level, the argument is based on freedom. Do we not have the right to improve ourselves, to overcome our biological limitations? If a person wants to enhance their own mind, what right does society have to stop them? This is the path of transhumanism and cognitive liberty. The ethical objections, however, are deeply troubling,
and center on the concept of fairness and the very definition of humanity. The most immediate and obvious problem would be the creation of a humanity gap, a new and potentially insurmountable form of inequality. If cognitive enhancement is expensive, it will only be available to the wealthy. This would create a two-tiered society: the cognitively enhanced elite and the naturals. How could an unenhanced person ever compete for a job, for a university spot, or for social status against someone with a perfect memory and a supercharged intelligence? This could create a biological caste system that would make all previous forms of inequality seem trivial. Another profound objection is the potential devaluation of the normal human experience. If everyone is expected to have a perfect memory, what happens to the human act of forgetting, of moving on from past traumas? If focus can be chemically induced, what happens to the virtue of discipline? The technology could create a world of intense pressure, where the normal range of human cognitive ability is seen as deficient. It could also lead to a homogenization of thought if everyone is optimized for the same kind of logical, efficient processing. The dilemma forces us to confront what it is we truly value about being human. Is our goal to transcend our limitations at all costs? Or is there a fundamental value in the messy, imperfect, and diverse range of the natural human mind? It is a conflict between the promise of a better humanity and the risk of losing what makes us human in the first place. The choice to enhance the mind is a profound one. An even more radical proposal involves not just improving our minds, but preserving them forever, a concept that challenges the very meaning of death itself.
Chapter 6: Digital Immortality and Uploaded Consciousness. The dilemma of cognitive enhancement is about improving the quality of the biological mind. We now leap into a far more speculative and philosophically profound territory: the attempt to escape biology altogether. This is the dilemma of digital immortality and the concept of uploading a human consciousness to a computer. Let us imagine a technology that can scan a living human brain with perfect fidelity, capturing the exact state of every neuron and synapse. This information is then used to create a perfect software simulation of that brain, which can be run on a powerful computer. When this simulation is activated, it wakes up. It has all the memories, the personality, the quirks, the very consciousness of the original person. The original biological person may then die, but their mind lives on, now as a purely digital entity. The arguments for pursuing this technology are rooted in one of humanity's oldest dreams, the conquest of death. Proponents see this as the ultimate triumph of science over our mortal limitations. To be able to preserve the minds of our greatest thinkers, artists, and loved ones forever would be an incredible gift to humanity. An uploaded consciousness could experience a potentially infinite existence. It could explore virtual worlds, travel the cosmos as a stream of data, and learn and grow for millennia. It represents a form of secular salvation, a promise that the self does not have to end with the death of the body. It is the ultimate expression of the will to live. The ethical and philosophical objections, however, are staggering. The central question is one of personal identity. Is the digital copy truly you, or is it just a perfect simulation, an echo that thinks it is you, while the real you simply ceased to exist when your biological brain died? This is the philosophical problem of continuity.
To create the upload might be to create a new conscious entity while simultaneously allowing your own consciousness to be extinguished. Another profound objection concerns the nature of this digital existence. What would it actually be like to live for 1,000 or 1,000,000 years? Could the human mind, which evolved for a finite lifespan, handle an eternity of existence without succumbing to an unimaginable form of boredom or madness? Furthermore, who controls the simulation? An uploaded consciousness would be completely dependent on the hardware and software that runs it. A corporation or a government could control your virtual world, edit your memories, or simply turn you off. You could be subjected to a digital hell, an eternity of torment from which there is no escape. The dilemma forces us to confront the very meaning of life and death. Is a finite life, with its urgency and its preciousness, what gives our existence meaning? Is death not a curse to be conquered, but a necessary and defining part of the human experience? To pursue digital immortality is to bet that we can transcend our biology without losing our soul. To reject it is to accept our place in the natural order. The question of whether an uploaded consciousness is still a person is a profound one. A related and more immediate question is whether a machine that is not conscious at all can still be entrusted with one of the most human of tasks, the administration of justice.
Chapter 7: Algorithmic Justice, the AI Judge. The dilemma of uploaded consciousness forces us to ask what constitutes a person. We now return to a more grounded but equally transformative dilemma that asks what constitutes a fair judge. This is the ethically charged proposal of using artificial intelligence to pass sentence in our criminal justice systems. Let us imagine a society that, in an effort to create a more efficient and unbiased justice system, develops an AI judge. This AI has been trained on the entirety of the nation's legal code, every precedent-setting case, and millions of past sentencing decisions. It can analyze the facts of a criminal case, consider the defendant's history, and apply the relevant laws with perfect consistency and speed. A human judge might hear a handful of cases in a day. The AI judge could process thousands. The arguments for implementing such a system are powerful and based on the ideal of pure, impartial justice. Proponents argue that an AI judge would be free from all the human biases that can plague our current system. The AI would not be subject to racism, sexism, or classism. It would not be influenced by whether it had a good breakfast or a bad commute. It would not be swayed by a charismatic lawyer or a defendant's emotional appeal. It would simply analyze the facts and apply the law, treating every single defendant in exactly the same way. It promises a world of radical consistency, where the sentence you receive does not depend on the mood or the personal prejudices of the judge you happen to get. It is the ultimate expression of the principle that justice should be blind. This is the path of logical, dispassionate justice. The ethical objections, however, are equally profound and center on the very soul of what justice means. The first major problem, as with predictive policing, is that the AI is trained on historical data, and that data is filled with human bias. The AI will learn the systemic biases of the past. If past judges have historically given harsher sentences to people from a certain demographic for a certain crime, the AI will learn that pattern and perpetuate it, cloaking old prejudices in the guise of objective technological impartiality. But the deeper, more philosophical objection is the absence of humanity. Is justice merely the consistent application of rules, or does it also require uniquely human qualities like compassion, empathy, and the ability to understand context?
An AI cannot understand the desperation that led a person to steal. It cannot appreciate the complexities of a tragic human story. It cannot grant mercy. It cannot understand the spirit of the law, only the letter. To be judged by a machine would be to be subjected to a system that is incapable of seeing you as a full human being. The dilemma is a conflict between our ideals of impartiality and our need for compassion. It forces us to decide what we truly want from our justice system. Do we want the cold, perfect consistency of a machine? Or do we accept the flawed, biased, but ultimately human judgment of our peers? The choice between these two models will define the very nature of justice in the 21st century. The idea of an AI judge is about machines passing judgment. An even more extreme proposal involves machines constantly watching, ensuring that no transgression ever goes unseen. We now turn to the ultimate dilemma of security versus freedom.
Chapter 8: Total Surveillance for Absolute Security. The dilemma of the AI judge is about delegating the act of judgment to a machine. We now explore the ultimate extension of technological control, the delegation of all observation to a pervasive surveillance network. This is the profound ethical conflict between the promise of absolute security and the principle of personal privacy. Let us imagine a society that has suffered a series of devastating terrorist attacks. In the aftermath, driven by fear and a desire for safety, the government proposes a new comprehensive security initiative called the Sentinel Program. This program would integrate every digital camera in the nation, public street cameras, private security cameras, and even the cameras on personal devices into a single AI-powered network. This network would use advanced facial recognition and behavioral analysis to monitor everyone, everywhere, all the time. The system would be designed to detect suspicious activity, identify criminals, and prevent crimes and terrorist acts before they happen. The argument for implementing this program is the most powerful one a state can make: the promise of absolute safety. Proponents would argue that in a world of complex and unpredictable threats, this is the only way to truly protect the citizenry. If a known terrorist walks into a public square, the system will identify them instantly. If a crime is committed, the system will have a perfect, unbiasable record of the event, ensuring the perpetrator is caught. The very knowledge that one is always being watched would be a powerful deterrent to criminal activity. It is a utilitarian argument on a grand scale. The sacrifice of privacy is a small price to pay for a society free from crime and terror. It is the path of security above all else. The ethical objections to such a system are a nightmare vision of a dystopian future. The central argument against it is the complete and total annihilation of privacy. In such a society, the very concept of a private life would cease to exist. Every conversation, every meeting, every mistake, every moment of personal vulnerability would be recorded and stored. This creates a digital panopticon where citizens are aware they are constantly being watched and therefore begin to censor their own behavior, even in private. This would have a devastating chilling effect on freedom of speech, on dissent, and on creativity. People would become afraid to express unpopular opinions or to associate with controversial groups for fear of being flagged by the algorithm. Another profound objection is the immense and irreversible concentration of power it would give to the state. A government with the ability to watch all of its citizens at all times would have the power to crush any opposition and to control every aspect of social and political life. It is the perfect tool for a totalitarian regime. The dilemma is a stark and absolute choice between two fundamental and perhaps incompatible human values: the desire to be safe and the desire to be free. It asks the ultimate question of a society. What is the purpose of a state? Is it to protect our bodies at all costs?
even if it means imprisoning our minds? Or is it to protect our liberty, even if it means accepting a world with a certain level of inherent risk? The balance we strike between these two poles will define the nature of our society. This dilemma of technological control marks the end of our first exploration into the uncharted territory. We now pivot from the ethics of the machines we are building to the ethics of the very biology we are becoming.
Chapter 9. Gene Editing for Enhancement. Designer Babies. We have concluded our exploration of the ethical frontiers of technology, from sentient AI to total surveillance. We now turn our attention from the ghost in the machine to the code within our own cells. We are entering the second uncharted territory, the profound and deeply personal dilemmas of bioethics. Our first stop on this new frontier is perhaps the most famous and contentious of all: the use of gene editing technologies like CRISPR, not just to cure diseases, but to enhance the human race. This is the world of designer babies. Let us imagine a near future where gene editing of human embryos is safe, effective, and commercially available. A wealthy couple is at a fertility clinic. They are having a child through in vitro fertilization. The clinic offers them a list of options. They can, of course, screen the embryo for devastating genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease, an application of the technology that most people would agree is ethically sound. But the clinic also offers a menu of enhancements. They can choose to give their child a genetic predisposition for higher intelligence, greater athletic ability, a specific hair and eye color, or a heightened resistance to a wide range of diseases. The arguments for allowing this are rooted in the principles of parental liberty and the pursuit of a better life. The parents would argue that it is their fundamental right to give their child the best possible start. If they can prevent their child from suffering from allergies or give them an intellectual edge that will help them succeed in a competitive world, why shouldn't they? They are not harming anyone. They are simply using an available technology to improve the life of their own child. This is no different, they might argue, than paying for expensive private schools or hiring a private sports coach. It is simply a more direct and efficient way of investing in their child's future. This is the path of procreative freedom. The ethical objections to this practice are profound and touch upon the very core of our social fabric. The most immediate concern is one of social justice. If genetic enhancement is expensive, it will only be available to the rich. This would create a new biological form of class division. Society would be split into the gen-rich, who are genetically designed for success, and the naturals, who must compete with their unenhanced biology. This could create a genetic aristocracy, a world where the gap between the haves and the have-nots is literally encoded in our DNA. Another deep concern is the specter of eugenics. The very act of choosing desirable traits implies that other traits are undesirable. This could lead to a society that is less tolerant of human diversity and that devalues people who are born with genetic imperfections or disabilities. It could create immense pressure on parents to conform to a narrow, socially defined ideal of the perfect child. Finally, there is the unknown risk of altering the human gene pool in ways we cannot predict. We would be taking control of our own evolution, a complex process that has unfolded over millions of years. and subjecting it to our own short-sighted desires and fashions. The dilemma is a conflict between our individual desire to improve our children and the collective risk of creating a more unequal and less tolerant society. It forces us to ask, are there certain aspects of the human condition that we should accept as given? Or is everything, including our own biology, subject to technological improvement? The choice of how to design our children is a monumental one. A related and equally challenging dilemma concerns not the beginning of life, but its potential lack of an end.
Chapter 10: Radical Life Extension and its Social Cost. The dilemma of gene editing is about the quality of the life we design. We now turn to a dilemma about the quantity of that life. This is the ethical minefield of radical life extension, the scientific quest to dramatically slow or even halt the human aging process. Let us imagine that a breakthrough has been made. A new gene therapy or a series of nanobot treatments can effectively stop aging, allowing a person to maintain the health and vitality of a 30-year-old for centuries. The treatment is not a hypothetical fountain of youth. It is a real, available medical procedure. The argument for embracing this technology is rooted in one of our most fundamental human desires, the will to live. Aging is the cause of most human suffering and disease: cancer, heart disease, dementia. To conquer aging would be to conquer our greatest enemy. Proponents would argue that there is no moral virtue in suffering and death. If we have the scientific means to extend our healthy lifespans indefinitely, we have a moral obligation to do so. Think of the benefits: centuries to learn new skills, to have multiple careers, to travel, to spend time with loved ones. Humanity's collective wisdom would grow exponentially as generations of brilliant minds continue to live and work. It is the ultimate expression of the human desire for more life. The ethical and social objections, however, are catastrophic in their scale. The first and most obvious problem is overpopulation and resource depletion. If people stop dying but continue to be born, the global population would explode. How would we feed and house a population of 20 or 30 billion people on a planet with finite resources? The environmental strain would be unimaginable. The second major problem is social stagnation. In our current model, the passing of generations allows for new ideas, new cultures, and new leadership to emerge. If the same generations remained in power for centuries, society could become frozen, unable to change or adapt. The young would be permanently ruled by the old, their opportunities for advancement stifled. A world without death could become a world without progress. The third and most immediate problem is one of justice and inequality. The treatment would, at least initially, be fantastically expensive. It would be available only to the ultra-wealthy. This would create a world of the immortal rich and the mortal poor. The wealthy would not just have more money, they would have more time, more life. This would be the most profound and terrifying form of inequality imaginable. A world where the rich literally live forever, while the poor live and die as they always have. The dilemma forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is aging and death not a disease to be cured, but a necessary and perhaps even benevolent feature of the human condition? Is our mortality what gives our lives urgency and meaning? To pursue radical life extension is to chase our most primal dream. But to achieve it, might be to create a social and ecological nightmare. The choice to extend life indefinitely is a profound one. An equally complex dilemma arises when we consider the creation of a new life that is a direct copy of an old one. We now turn to the ethics of human cloning.
Chapter 11. Human Cloning. The Question of Identity and Soul. The dilemma of radical life extension is about prolonging a single, unique life. We now turn to a technology that proposes to duplicate a life, raising profound questions about what it is that makes us unique. This is the ethically charged and culturally resonant dilemma of human reproductive cloning. Let us imagine a couple who has tragically lost their only young child in an accident. Overwhelmed by a grief so profound that they cannot imagine life without their son, they turn to a controversial fertility clinic. The clinic offers them a chance to use a preserved sample of their son's DNA to create a clone, a genetically identical twin born at a later date. They would be able to raise a child who, at least physically, is a perfect copy of the son they lost. The argument for allowing this is rooted in the principles of reproductive freedom and profound compassion. From the parent's perspective, this is not a monstrous act of scientific hubris, but a desperate and loving attempt to heal an unbearable wound. They are not trying to replace their son, they might argue, but to have another child to whom they can give their love and who will share a deep biological connection to the one they lost. If a couple has the right to use in vitro fertilization or other reproductive technologies, why should they be denied this one? It is a choice born of overwhelming love and grief, a desire to mend a shattered family. The ethical arguments against human reproductive cloning, however, are vast and deeply unsettling. The first set of objections is based on the well-being of the cloned child. A clone would be born into an impossible and unprecedented psychological situation. They would grow up in the shadow of a ghost sibling, constantly being compared, consciously or unconsciously, to the child they are a copy of. They would be burdened with the immense weight of their parents' grief and expectations. Furthermore, their genetic destiny would be known. They would know their predispositions to certain diseases, their physical appearance, their potential lifespan, all based on the life of their genetic twin. This could strip the child of their sense of a unique identity and an open future, the very things we consider essential for a healthy human life. The second set of objections is more philosophical. Cloning challenges our deeply held beliefs about human individuality and what it means to be a unique person. Would a clone have their own soul? Would they be seen as a full human being or as a mere copy, a manufactured product? The very act of creating a person not through the natural lottery of genetic recombination, but through a deliberate act of replication, could devalue human life, treating it as something that... The dilemma forces us to confront the question of what makes us who we are. Is our identity simply the product of our genes, or is it the unique, unrepeatable journey of our consciousness through the world? To permit cloning is to embrace a new and radical form of reproductive technology that could offer comfort to grieving parents. To forbid it is to protect the potential psychological well-being of the cloned individual,
and to uphold a more traditional view of human uniqueness and dignity. The ethics of creating a copy of a human are profound. An equally complex dilemma arises when we consider creating a life form that has never existed before.
Chapter 12: The Creation of Synthetic Life Forms. The dilemma of human cloning is about replicating a known life form. We now leap into a territory that is even more fundamentally uncharted: the creation of entirely new synthetic life forms in a laboratory. This is the world of synthetic biology, where scientists are no longer just editing life, but writing it from scratch. Let's imagine a team of brilliant bioengineers who have achieved a monumental breakthrough. They have designed a new, single-celled organism on a computer. They have then synthesized its DNA from base chemicals in the lab and have successfully booted it up, creating the world's first truly artificial, self-replicating life form. The potential benefits of this technology are almost limitless. Proponents argue that synthetic biology is one of our most powerful tools to solve humanity's greatest challenges. Scientists could design microbes to eat plastic waste in the oceans. They could create bacteria that efficiently produce clean biofuels. They could engineer organisms that can sense and destroy cancer cells within the human body. This technology offers the promise of a new industrial revolution, one based on biology rather than mechanics, leading to sustainable solutions for energy, medicine, and environmental cleanup. It is the ultimate expression of human ingenuity, using the language of life itself to build a better world. The ethical objections, however, are as vast as the potential benefits. The first and most immediate concern is one of biosecurity and unintended consequences. What would happen if one of these newly created organisms were to accidentally escape from the lab? We have no idea how it would interact with the natural ecosystem. A microbe designed to eat plastic, for instance, could potentially evolve to attack other, more vital materials. Because it is a form of life that has never existed before, natural organisms would have no defense against it. A synthetic organism could become an invasive species on a microscopic scale, a form of biological pollution with potentially catastrophic and irreversible consequences for the planet's biosphere. The second set of objections is more philosophical, a concern about playing God. By creating life from non-living matter, are we crossing a fundamental moral boundary? Do we, as creators of this new life, have a set of ethical responsibilities towards it? Does an artificial organism have any moral status? This technology forces us to ask what we truly mean by life. It blurs the line between the living and the created, the natural and the artificial. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits the immense promise of solving some of the world's most intractable problems against the terrifying risk of unleashing an uncontrollable and potentially devastating new form of life. To pursue this technology is to embrace our power as creators. To restrict it is to acknowledge our wisdom
as creatures who are part of a delicate and interconnected natural world that we do not fully understand. The creation of new life is a monumental step. A related and perhaps more intimate ethical challenge involves not creating a new life, but editing the very fabric of our memories.
Chapter 13. Memory Modification. Erasing Trauma versus Erasing Self. The dilemma of creating synthetic life is about authoring new biological entities. We now turn inward to a technology that would allow us to be the authors of our own past. This is the ethically complex and deeply personal frontier of memory modification. Let's imagine a new medical treatment that allows for the precise editing or even complete erasure of specific memories. The primary application of this technology would be therapeutic. For individuals suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, soldiers haunted by the horrors of war, victims of violent crime, survivors of terrible accidents, this treatment could be a miraculous cure. It could selectively erase the single traumatic memory that is the source of their debilitating flashbacks, nightmares, and anxiety, allowing them to live a normal, functional life again. The argument for this technology is rooted in a profound sense of compassion. It is a tool to alleviate immense human suffering. Proponents would argue that there is no virtue in being haunted by a memory that destroys one's quality of life. To be able to remove that single toxic memory would be an act of profound healing. It would be no different, they might argue, than surgically removing a cancerous tumor. It is the removal of a pathological element to restore a person to health. It is the ultimate expression of the medical duty to relieve suffering. The ethical objections, however, are subtle and deeply philosophical. The central concern is the relationship between our memories and our identity. Are we not, in a fundamental way, the sum of our experiences, both good and bad? Our memories, even the painful ones, shape who we are. The experience of surviving a trauma and learning to live with its memory can be a source of profound strength, resilience, and empathy. To simply erase the memory of a trauma is to erase a part of one's own history, a part of one's own self. Is a person who no longer remembers a key life-altering event truly the same person? Another concern is the potential for misuse. If we can erase bad memories, what is to stop us from erasing memories of our own mistakes, our own guilt? Could a person commit a crime and then pay to have the memory of it erased, thereby absolving themselves of any remorse? Could this technology lead to a world where we are less accountable for our actions, a world of perpetual artificial innocence? It could devalue the importance of learning from our mistakes and the very process of moral growth. The dilemma forces us to ask a fundamental question. What is the purpose of memory? Is it simply a record of events which can be curated and edited for our own comfort? Or is it the very fabric of our identity, a sacred, inalterable text that defines who we are? The choice is between the compassionate desire to end suffering and the profound respect for the integrity of the self. To embrace the technology is to prioritize well-being. To reject it is to prioritize authenticity. The question of how we define and preserve our own human identity is central. A different kind of challenge to our identity arises when we consider blurring the biological lines between ourselves and other species. Chapter 14. Xenotransplantation. The use of animal organs. The dilemma of memory modification is about the integrity of our personal psychological identity. We now turn to a dilemma that challenges the integrity of our physical, biological identity as a species. This is the ethically charged and medically promising field of xenotransplantation, the transplantation of animal organs into humans. Let us imagine a world where the shortage of human organs for transplant is a crisis that claims thousands of lives every year. To solve this problem, scientists have perfected a new technology. They can now genetically engineer pigs so that their organs, their hearts, kidneys, and livers are immunologically compatible with the human body. These pigs are raised in sterile, biosecure facilities, and their organs can be harvested to save the lives of human patients who would otherwise die while waiting for a human donor. The argument for this technology is a powerful and straightforward utilitarian one. It is about saving human lives. For a person dying of heart failure, the choice between certain death and receiving a pig's heart is no choice at all. Proponents would argue that we already use animals for food, for clothing, and for medical research. To use them to provide life-saving organs is a natural and ethically consistent extension of this existing relationship. The life of a human being, they would argue, is of greater moral value than the life of a pig. If we can save a child, a parent, or a sibling by sacrificing an animal that was raised for that specific purpose, we have a moral imperative to do so. It is a pragmatic and compassionate solution to a devastating medical problem. The ethical objections, however, come from several different angles. The first is a concern for animal rights. Opponents would argue that this technology turns animals into mere biological factories, living warehouses for spare parts. Pigs are intelligent, social creatures. To breed them and raise them for the sole purpose of being harvested for their organs is a profound act of exploitation and a violation of their right to exist for their own sake. This perspective challenges the very idea of human supremacy and argues for the moral consideration of non-human animals. The second major objection is a concern for public health and safety. Transplanting an organ from one species to another carries the risk of xenozoonosis, the transmission of animal viruses into the human population. Scientists can screen for known pig viruses, but there is always the risk of a new, unknown virus crossing the species barrier. Such an event could potentially trigger a new and devastating pandemic. The risk, however small, is a global one. The dilemma pits the certain benefit of saving an individual human life right now against the potential catastrophic risk to the entire human population in the future, as well as the ethical concerns for the rights of the animals involved. It forces us to ask, what is the moral price we are willing to pay to extend human life? And how much unknown risk are we willing to assume for a known reward? The choice reflects our society's fundamental views on the relationship between humans, animals, and the very nature of biological risk. This dilemma is about saving lives that are nearing their end. An even more complex dilemma arises when we consider the choice to end a life that is not terminal, but is filled with unbearable suffering. Chapter 15. The Right to Die for Non-Terminal Illness. The dilemma of xenotransplantation is about our right to use other lives to save our own. We now confront a deeply personal and controversial dilemma about our right to end our own life, not in the face of a terminal illness, but in the face of unbearable, intractable suffering. This is the ethical frontier of medical assistance in dying for non-terminal conditions. Let us imagine a man in his 40s. Let's call him Stephen.
Stephen does not have cancer or any other terminal physical illness. However, he suffers from a severe, treatment-resistant form of depression and anxiety that has plagued him his entire adult life. He has exhausted every available treatment, years of psychotherapy, every class of medication, electroconvulsive therapy. Nothing has provided him with lasting relief. His daily existence is a state of constant, profound psychological pain, a form of suffering that is invisible to others, but is, for him, a relentless and unbearable torture. He has come to the calm, rational, and persistent conclusion that his life is no longer worth living. He petitions a medical ethics board for the right to medical assistance in dying. The arguments for granting his request are rooted in the principles of compassion and personal autonomy. Proponents would argue that suffering is suffering, whether its source is a physical tumor or a neurochemical imbalance. To deny a person relief from unbearable suffering simply because their illness is mental rather than physical is a form of discrimination. Stephen is a competent adult who is making a considered and enduring decision. The principle of autonomy suggests that he, and he alone, should be the ultimate authority over his own life and his own body. If his suffering is truly intractable, and his quality of life is, from his own perspective, non-existent, then the most compassionate act is to respect his wish to end that suffering peacefully and with dignity. The ethical arguments against granting his request are equally powerful and are based on the sanctity of life and the duty of care. Opponents would argue that depression, while a terrible illness, is fundamentally a condition that distorts one's thinking. They would question whether a person in the depths of a depressive episode can ever be truly considered competent to make an irreversible decision to die. Is his wish to die a rational choice, or is it a symptom of the very illness that needs to be treated? Furthermore, the role of a doctor is to preserve life and to do no harm. To participate in the intentional ending of a life that is not otherwise terminal is a violation of the most fundamental principles of medicine. It could also be a slippery slope, leading to a world where euthanasia becomes a solution for all kinds of social and psychological suffering. The dilemma is a profound one. It forces us to ask, what is the nature of unbearable suffering? And who gets to decide when a life is no longer worth living? It pits our belief in individual autonomy against our societal and medical commitment to the preservation of life. The choice to grant or deny Stephen's request is a testament to the immense complexity of this gray area where compassion can lead to two diametrically opposed conclusions. This dilemma is about a personal choice with societal implications. An even larger dilemma arises when we must make a choice for the entire globe, allocating a life-saving resource in the midst of a worldwide crisis.
Chapter 16. Global Allocation of Pandemic Cures. The dilemma of the right to die is about a single person's choice to end their life. We now scale up to the level of the entire human population, to a dilemma about how to save lives on a global scale. This is the urgent and deeply political ethical challenge of how to allocate a life-saving vaccine or cure during a deadly global pandemic. Let us imagine a new and virulent pandemic is sweeping across the globe. A consortium of scientists in a wealthy, developed nation, let's call it Nation A, has just developed the world's first effective vaccine. They have the capacity to produce millions of doses, but it will take many months to produce enough for everyone in the world. an immediate and critical ethical question arises. Who gets the vaccine first? The government of Nation A is under immense pressure from its own citizens. The argument for vaccine nationalism is powerful and intuitive. The government's primary duty, its leaders would argue, is to its own people. The vaccine was developed using their taxpayers' money and the ingenuity of their scientists. Therefore, their first obligation is to vaccinate their own population, particularly their own healthcare workers and vulnerable citizens. Only after they have secured the health of their own nation should they begin to export the vaccine to other countries. This is a path guided by the principle of national self-interest and a government's primary responsibility to its own citizens. The ethical argument for a global, equitable allocation, however, is equally compelling. Proponents of this view, including the World Health Organization, would argue that from a purely ethical standpoint, a human life is a human life, regardless of nationality. A nurse in a poor, developing nation, Nation B, is of no less moral worth than a nurse in Nation A. Therefore, the allocation should be based on need, not nationality or wealth. The first doses should go to healthcare workers and the most vulnerable populations in all countries simultaneously. This approach, known as global health justice, is rooted in a principle of shared humanity. Beyond the purely ethical argument, there is also a pragmatic public health argument for this approach. In a globalized world, no one is safe until everyone is safe. If the virus is allowed to rage unchecked in Nation B, it will continue to mutate, potentially creating new, more dangerous variants that could be resistant to the current vaccine. To hoard the vaccine in wealthy nations is not just morally questionable, it is a strategically foolish public health decision that puts the entire world at risk. The dilemma is a stark conflict between national interest and global responsibility. It pits a leader's duty to their own people against the ethical and practical imperative for a global, coordinated response. The choice made by wealthy nations in this scenario reveals their true position on the value of a human life and their commitment to the global community. It is a shade of gray that tests the very foundations of our international order. Having explored the profound dilemmas at the frontiers of life and death, we now pivot to a new, uncharted territory, the very architecture of our societies and the conflicts over justice, rights, and how we share our collective burdens. Chapter 17. Historical Reparations. We have concluded our exploration of the frontiers of bioethics from the beginning of life to its end. We now enter our third uncharted territory, the complex and often painful dilemmas that define the architecture of our societies. We begin with a question that reaches deep into the past to demand justice in the present, the ethical case for and against historical reparations. Let us imagine a modern, democratic nation with a dark history. Centuries ago, the nation's prosperity was built on the brutal institution of slavery. Millions of people were kidnapped, enslaved, and forced into unpaid labor for generations. Though slavery was abolished over 150 years ago, its legacy has persisted. The descendants of the enslaved population have continued to face systemic discrimination, economic disadvantage, and social inequality, while the descendants of the slave-owning class and the nation as a whole
have continued to benefit from the wealth that was originally built on that stolen labor. A proposal is now being seriously debated in the nation's legislature to pay reparations to the living descendants of the enslaved. This could take the form of direct financial payments, investments in their communities, or educational and housing grants. The argument for reparations is rooted in the principle of restorative justice. Proponents argue that the abolition of slavery was not enough. The immense economic and social debt that was created was never paid. The current vast wealth gap between the descendants of the enslaved and the rest of society is not an accident. It is the direct, predictable result of centuries of stolen labor followed by decades of systemic discrimination. Reparations, in this view, are not a handout. They are the long overdue payment for a historical crime. It is an attempt to repair a profound and ongoing injustice and to finally begin to level a playing field that has been tilted for centuries. The ethical arguments against reparations are also powerful and complex. Opponents argue that it is impractical and unfair to hold the current generation responsible for the sins of their ancestors. They would say, "I never owned a slave. My family immigrated here long after slavery was abolished. Why should I have to pay for a crime I did not commit?" This perspective is based on a principle of individual rather than collective or inherited responsibility. Another major objection is a practical one. How would such a program even work? How would one definitively prove their lineage? How would one calculate the proper amount of compensation for a crime committed centuries ago? The logistical and administrative challenges seem insurmountable and would likely lead to endless disputes and resentment. Critics also argue that such a program would be deeply divisive, creating a new set of racial grievances and further fracturing a society that should be trying to move forward together. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits the powerful moral claim for restorative justice against the equally powerful principles of individual responsibility and social cohesion. It forces a nation to confront the most painful parts of its history and to ask, what do we owe to the past? And who is responsible for paying that debt? There is no easy answer that will satisfy everyone. The debate over reparations is a testament to the long and difficult shadow that historical injustices can cast over the present. The question of who owes what to whom is central here. A similar but future-facing question arises at our borders as we now explore the ethics of immigration.
Chapter 18: The Ethics of Open Borders. The dilemma of historical reparations is about rectifying the injustices of the past. We now turn to a dilemma that is about our obligations to the people of the present and the future. The radical and profoundly challenging ethical argument for open borders. Let us imagine a world structured much like our own, with nations of varying wealth, stability, and opportunity. A philosopher proposes a simple but revolutionary idea that every human being should have the fundamental right to live and work in any country they choose. In this view, national borders as we know them, which restrict the free movement of people, are a form of unjust, birth-based discrimination. The argument for open borders is rooted in a principle of global justice and liberal equality. Proponents argue that the country a person is born in is a matter of pure random luck.
To be born in a peaceful, prosperous nation with abundant opportunities is to win the birth lottery. To be born in a war-torn, impoverished nation is to lose it. Why, they ask, should our fundamental life chances be determined by this accident of birth? They argue that restricting immigration is a form of feudalism on a global scale, where people are tied to the land of their birth. An open borders policy would, in theory, be one of the most powerful tools for alleviating global poverty. People from poor countries could move to rich countries to find work, dramatically increasing their own income and sending remittances back to their families. It is an expression of the idea that all human beings are of equal moral worth, regardless of their place of birth. The ethical arguments against open borders are equally powerful and are based on the principles of national sovereignty and community self-determination. Opponents would argue that a nation is more than just a piece of land. It is a community with a shared culture, language, and a set of social and political institutions. A massive, unregulated influx of people from different cultures could overwhelm these institutions and erode the social trust and cohesion that are necessary for a functional society. Another major objection is an economic one. While proponents argue that immigration is a net economic benefit, critics fear that a wave of low-skilled workers could depress wages for the poorest citizens of the host country and place an unsustainable strain on social services like healthcare, education, and welfare. Finally, there is the argument for national security. A policy of open borders would, critics argue, make it impossible for a nation to control who enters, potentially allowing criminals and terrorists to cross with ease. The dilemma is a fundamental conflict between two different views of the world. One view sees humanity as a single global community, and it prioritizes the rights of the individual regardless of their origin. The other view sees the world as a collection of distinct national communities, and it prioritizes the right of those communities to self-determination and the protection of their own citizens. There is no easy compromise between these two worldviews. The question of open borders forces us to confront our deepest beliefs about who we are and what we owe to each other in a deeply unequal world. The question of how to treat outsiders is a profound one. An even more complex question arises when we consider how a society should treat those within its own borders who hold intolerant and dangerous ideas.
Chapter 19. The Paradox of Tolerance. The dilemma of open borders forces us to question our obligations to those outside our community. We now turn inward to a classic and deeply challenging philosophical problem that questions our obligations to those within our community who wish to destroy it. This is the paradox of tolerance. Let us imagine a healthy, open, and tolerant liberal democracy. Its constitution guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the equal rights of all its citizens, regardless of their race, religion, or background. This tolerance is the very foundation of its society. Within this society, a new political movement begins to emerge. This movement is fundamentally intolerant. Its members openly advocate for the suppression of minority rights. They spread hateful propaganda, call for the repeal of equal protection laws, and argue that the tolerant, pluralistic nature of the society is a weakness that must be destroyed and replaced with an authoritarian, homogeneous state. They are using the very freedoms and protections of the tolerant society, their right to speak, to publish, to protest, with the express goal of one day eliminating those freedoms
for everyone else. The society is now faced with the paradox of tolerance, famously articulated by the philosopher Karl Popper. The question is this: in order to remain a tolerant society, must we tolerate intolerance? The first path is to adhere to a principle of absolute tolerance. This view argues that the commitment to free speech and equal rights must be absolute and unwavering. We must tolerate all views, even those we find hateful and repugnant. The moment we start to make exceptions, the moment we start to say, this kind of speech is not allowed, we have abandoned our own principles and have started down the slippery slope towards censorship and oppression. The best way to combat bad ideas, in this view, is not with suppression, but with better ideas. A truly strong, tolerant society should have the confidence that it can win the argument in the open marketplace of ideas. The other path argues that this approach is dangerously naive. This view, sometimes called militant tolerance, argues that a society's duty of tolerance does not extend to those who are themselves intolerant and who seek to destroy the very framework of tolerance. To tolerate those who are actively working to destroy tolerance is a form of societal suicide. It is to passively stand by while the foundations of your house are being dismantled. Therefore, a tolerant society has not only a right, but a duty to be intolerant of intolerance. This means using legal means to suppress hate speech, to ban intolerant organizations, and to refuse to give a platform to those who would use it to spread hatred and division. The dilemma is a profound one, because it reveals a potential self-destructive mechanism at the very heart of the ideal of tolerance. It is a conflict between adhering to a pure, absolute principle and taking a pragmatic, self-protective stance. If we are absolutists about tolerance, do we risk being destroyed by the intolerant? If we become intolerant of the intolerant, have we not become the very thing we sought to oppose? The way a society navigates this paradox is one of the most difficult and crucial tests of its own maturity and resilience. The paradox of tolerance is about ideas we wish to suppress. A related and very modern dilemma is about information we wish to erase. As we now explore the right to be forgotten.
Chapter 20: The Right to be Forgotten. The paradox of tolerance is about whether a society should be forced to remember and give a platform to hateful ideas. We now turn to a related but distinctly individual and modern dilemma: whether an individual has the right to force society to forget their own past. This is the complex conflict known as the right to be forgotten. Let us imagine a man named John who, in his early 20s, made a terrible mistake. He was convicted of a non-violent financial crime and he served his time in prison. After his release, he worked hard to rebuild his life. He found a low-level job, went back to school, and over the course of 15 years, he has become a respected small business owner, a loving husband and father, and a pillar of his local community. He has, by all accounts, paid his debt to society and has completely reformed himself. However, his past is always just one Google search away. A local news article detailing his original crime is still online and is one of the first results that appears when you search his name. Every time he meets a new client, a new neighbor, or a new friend, he lives in fear that they will search his name and discover this old mistake. He feels that he is being perpetually punished, forever defined by the worst moment of his life from 2 decades ago. John now petitions a search engine
to have this old news article de-linked from his name. The argument for his right to be forgotten is rooted in the principles of forgiveness, rehabilitation, and the ability for a person to have a second chance. Proponents would argue that in the digital age, where information is permanent and instantly accessible, our society has lost the capacity for forgetting. A youthful mistake can now follow a person like a digital ghost for their entire life, creating a permanent barrier to their full reintegration into society. The right to be forgotten is the right to move on from one's past. It is the right to a clean slate after one has paid their debt. It is a compassionate argument for allowing personal growth and redemption. The ethical arguments against this right, however, are equally powerful and are based on the principles of free speech, the public's right to know, and the integrity of the historical record. Opponents, including many journalists and free speech advocates, would argue that this is a form of censorship. The news article is a factual, historical document. To de-link it is to erase a piece of public history. They would argue that the public has a right to be informed about the past of the people in their community, especially a person who was convicted of a financial crime. Furthermore, where do you draw the line? Should all crimes be forgettable? What about violent crimes? To grant this right is to start down a slippery slope where powerful people could scrub their pasts of any inconvenient or negative information, creating a sanitized and untrustworthy public record. The dilemma is a fundamental conflict between the individual's right to privacy and redemption and the public's right to information and an unaltered history. It pits the value of forgiveness against the value of truth. In the digital age, where the past is no longer the past, the question of what we should be allowed to forget may be one of the most defining ethical challenges of our time. This conflict between the individual and society's record is profound. We now pivot to an even more fundamental question about the relationship between the individual and society, how we should structure our very economy in the face of a future where human labor may no longer be necessary.
Chapter 21. Universal Basic Income, UBI, in an Automated World. The right to be forgotten is a dilemma about our relationship with our digital past. We now turn to a profound dilemma about our relationship with our economic future, a future that may be fundamentally reshaped by technology. This is the radical and increasingly urgent debate over universal basic income. Let us imagine a society in the not-so-distant future where artificial intelligence and robotics have advanced to the point where they can perform the vast majority of human jobs, from trucking and manufacturing to accounting and even medical diagnostics. This massive wave of automation creates unprecedented wealth and efficiency, but it also leads to mass unemployment, as human labor becomes economically obsolete. In this context, a radical proposal is put forward. The government will provide every single citizen, regardless of their employment status, with a universal basic income, a regular, unconditional payment sufficient to cover their basic needs, like food, housing, and health care. The argument for UBI is rooted in principles of social justice and a pragmatic response to a new economic reality. Proponents argue that in a world where the wealth is generated by machines that are owned by a small number of people, the traditional link between labor and income will be broken for millions. Without a mechanism like UBI to redistribute this machine-generated wealth, society would face a crisis of unimaginable inequality
and social unrest. UBI, in this view, is not a form of charity. It is a just dividend, a share of the collective technological inheritance of humanity. It would provide a crucial safety net, freeing people from the fear of destitution and allowing them to pursue education, creative endeavors, caregiving, or community work that may not be valued by the traditional market. It is a vision of a future where technology liberates humanity from drudgery, not condemns it to poverty. The ethical and practical arguments against UBI, however, are also deeply compelling. The first major objection is a psychological and moral one. Critics argue that work is not just about income. It is a source of purpose, identity, and social connection. If millions of people are paid to do nothing, could it lead to a society plagued by apathy, boredom, and a loss of meaning? This perspective holds that there is an inherent dignity in labor, and that to remove the expectation of work would be to undermine the very character and drive of the population. The second objection is an economic one. The cost of providing a basic income to every citizen would be astronomical. It would require a massive and potentially unsustainable level of taxation on the productive parts of the economy. Critics fear it could lead to rampant inflation, a devaluing of the currency, and a disincentive for anyone who can work to actually do so, leading to a downward spiral of economic stagnation. The dilemma is a fundamental one about the future of work, value, and human purpose. It pits a vision of a technologically liberated, equitable society against a more traditional view that links human dignity and economic value to the act of labor. It forces us to ask, if machines do all the work, what is the purpose of a human being? And what do we owe each other in such a world? The answer we choose will define the very structure of our 21st century society. The question of how to distribute wealth is central to UBI. A related and more ancient question concerns how we should view the purpose of punishment for those who break our society's rules.
Chapter 22. The Punishment of Criminals. Retribution versus Rehabilitation. The dilemma of UBI is about how society should care for its members in the future. We now turn to a dilemma about how society should treat those who have harmed it in the past. This is the ancient, fundamental, and unresolved debate at the heart of our criminal justice system. Is the primary purpose of punishment retribution or rehabilitation? Let's imagine a man has been convicted of a serious crime, such as an armed robbery in which someone was injured. He is now before a judge to be sentenced. The judge is the embodiment of society's response, and her decision will be guided by one of two competing philosophies of justice. The first philosophy is retribution. This view argues that the primary purpose of punishment is to inflict a proportionate harm on the offender in return for the harm they have caused. It is the principle of an eye for an eye, of paying a just debt to society. The focus of retributive justice is on the past act. The punishment is a moral and ethical necessity to restore balance and to formally condemn the criminal act. It provides a sense of closure and justice for the victims and for society as a whole. From this perspective, to be overly concerned with the criminal's future well-being is to disrespect the suffering of the victim. The sentence, therefore, should be severe, focused on deprivation of liberty in a harsh prison environment. This is the path of just deserts. The second philosophy is rehabilitation.
This view argues that the primary purpose of punishment is to reform the offender and to prevent future crimes. The focus of rehabilitative justice is on the future. It sees the criminal act not as a moral failing to be punished, but as a symptom of a deeper problem, perhaps addiction, mental illness, lack of education, or poverty. The goal of the sentence in this view should not be to make the offender suffer, but to address the root causes of their behavior. The prison sentence should include robust programs for therapy, education, and job training, with the ultimate aim of returning the person to society as a productive and law-abiding citizen. This approach is utilitarian. It seeks to reduce future crime, which benefits society as a whole. It is also a compassionate approach, seeing the offender as a person capable of change and redemption. The dilemma is a profound one because it reflects two fundamentally different views of human nature. Is a criminal a bad person who must be punished, or a broken person who must be fixed? The retributive model feels emotionally satisfying and provides a strong sense of justice for the victim. The rehabilitative model seems more pragmatic in the long run and offers a more hopeful and compassionate vision. Most modern justice systems are an uneasy and often contradictory mix of these two philosophies. The choice of which to prioritize, a harsh sentence that satisfies our desire for retribution, or a more lenient, program-focused sentence that aims for rehabilitation, is a constant and deeply divisive ethical challenge. It defines not just the fate of the offender, but the very character of our society. This dilemma is about justice for an individual. An even more abstract challenge arises when we consider what one generation owes to the next, a question of justice across time.
Chapter 23: Generational Justice, the Debt We Leave Behind. The debate between retribution and rehabilitation is about justice within the present generation. We now expand our timeline to consider one of the most profound and invisible ethical challenges, the concept of generational justice. This is the dilemma of what the current generation owes to the generations that are not yet born. Let us imagine the leaders of a modern, developed nation. They are facing a series of difficult policy choices. On one hand, they could cut taxes for the current population and increase spending on social programs for today's citizens, such as pensions and healthcare for the elderly. These policies would be incredibly popular. They would provide immediate, tangible benefits to the voters who are alive right now, increasing their standard of living and sense of security. To fund these policies, the government would have to engage in massive deficit spending, taking on trillions of dollars in national debt. On the other hand, they are also facing the escalating crisis of climate change. To meaningfully combat it would require immense, costly investments in green technology and a fundamental restructuring of the economy. It would also require regulations and carbon taxes that would increase the cost of living for the current generation. The benefits of this action would not be felt for many decades, long after the current leaders and most of the current voters are gone. The primary beneficiaries would be future generations. The political and ethical dilemma is stark. The path of prioritizing the present is politically expedient and directly benefits the people who can vote. The argument is one of immediate responsibility. A government's primary duty, some would argue, is to the well-being of its current citizens. The future is uncertain, and future generations will likely be wealthier and more technologically advanced, and therefore better equipped to handle their own problems. To ask the current generation to make a significant economic sacrifice for the benefit of distant, unborn people feels like an unfair and abstract demand. This is the path of prioritizing the present.
The other path is guided by the principle of generational justice. This ethical framework argues that we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Proponents would argue that it is a profound moral failure to live comfortably today by accumulating a massive financial and environmental debt that our grandchildren will be forced to pay. To fund our current lifestyle with unsustainable debt is a form of generational theft. To ignore the climate crisis is to knowingly and selfishly degrade the planet that future generations will have to inhabit. This perspective holds that we have a deep ethical obligation to people who do not yet exist, a duty to be good ancestors. The dilemma is a conflict between our duties to the present and our duties to the future. It is particularly difficult because the future has no voice. The unborn cannot vote, they cannot protest, they cannot advocate for their own interests. Their well-being depends entirely on the moral foresight and self-discipline of the current generation. The choice to consume and borrow for our own benefit, or to save and invest for the benefit of our descendants, is one of the most significant and defining ethical challenges of our time. It is a test of our ability to think beyond our lifespans. The question of what one group owes another is central to this dilemma. A related and highly contentious question arises when one group adopts the cultural practices of another, as we will now explore.
Chapter 24: Cultural Appropriation versus Cultural Appreciation. The dilemma of generational justice is about what is owed between different time periods. We now turn to a dilemma that is intensely of our time, about what is owed between different cultures living in the same period. This is the highly contested, nuanced, and often emotionally charged line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. Let's imagine a young, white fashion designer who is deeply inspired by the traditional art and clothing of a Native American tribe. She finds the patterns beautiful, the symbolism powerful, and the history rich. She decides to create a new fashion line that incorporates these traditional designs into modern clothing. Her intention is purely positive. She is not trying to mock or disrespect the culture. She is trying to honor it, to share its beauty with a wider audience. From her perspective, this is an act of cultural appreciation. She is celebrating the art of another culture, which she sees as a way of promoting multiculturalism and cross-cultural understanding. She might argue that culture is not static, that it is meant to be shared and remixed, and that to put a wall around a culture and say, "This is only for us," is a form of segregation. This is the argument for a fluid, shared cultural commons. The ethical counter-argument, however, is that this act is a form of cultural appropriation. This perspective argues that when a member of a dominant majority culture takes and uses elements from a minority culture that has historically been oppressed, it is not an equal exchange. The designer, a member of the culture that historically colonized and nearly exterminated Native American tribes, is now profiting from their cultural heritage, while the members of that tribe continue to face systemic poverty and discrimination. Furthermore, she is likely stripping the traditional designs of their deep, sacred, and contextual meaning, reducing them to a mere aesthetic, a costume for the dominant culture to play with. This, critics would argue, is not an act of honor, but an act of trivialization and theft. It continues a long history of the dominant culture taking what it wants from minority cultures without understanding, without permission, and without compensation. The dilemma is a profound one. It forces us to ask, who owns culture? Is it the shared property of all humanity? Or is it the specific protected heritage of a particular group. The line between appreciation and appropriation is a notoriously gray and blurry one. It often depends on a complex web of factors: intention, power dynamics, context, and the degree of consultation and compensation with the source community. To the designer, her fashion line is a tribute. To a member of the tribe, it could be a painful and insulting continuation of a long history of cultural theft. The way we navigate this dilemma reveals our understanding of history, power, and the very nature of cultural identity in a multicultural world. This marks the end of our exploration of the architecture of society. We now zoom out to an even wider perspective to examine the dilemmas that arise from the interactions between nations and cultures on the global stage.
Chapter 25: Humanitarian Military Intervention. We have concluded our exploration of the dilemmas that shape our societies from within. We now enter our fourth uncharted territory: the complex and often violent dilemmas that define our relationships with each other on the global stage. We begin with one of the most consequential and deadly questions a nation can face: the ethics of humanitarian military intervention. Let us imagine a sovereign nation that has descended into a brutal civil war. The nation's tyrannical government is committing systematic atrocities against its own people, targeting a specific ethnic minority. There is clear and undeniable evidence of mass killings, ethnic cleansing, and other crimes against humanity. The international community, through the United Nations, has attempted diplomacy, sanctions, and negotiations, but all have failed. The slaughter continues. The world is watching a genocide unfold in real time. A coalition of powerful, democratic nations is now contemplating a drastic step: a military intervention. This would involve launching airstrikes against the tyrannical government's military assets and potentially sending in ground troops to protect the civilian population and to create safe zones. The argument for intervention is rooted in the powerful ethical doctrine known as the responsibility to protect, R2P. This principle holds that national sovereignty is not absolute. When a state is unable or unwilling to protect its own population from mass atrocities, the responsibility to do so falls to the international community. Proponents would argue that to stand by and do nothing in the face of genocide is to be a passive accomplice to a monstrous evil. It is a betrayal of our shared humanity. Military intervention, in this view, is not an act of war for national gain, but a necessary and moral act of global policing to stop a crime that offends all of humanity. It is the path of compassionate, active intervention. The ethical arguments against military intervention, however, are equally powerful and are born of bitter historical experience. The first objection is a pragmatic one. Military interventions are incredibly complex and often fail, leading to unintended and catastrophic consequences. The intervention could become a bloody, prolonged quagmire, a war without end that kills more civilians than it saves. It could destabilize the entire region, creating a power vacuum
that is filled by even more extremist groups. The road to hell, critics would argue, is often paved with good intentions. The second objection is a legal and philosophical one. Who decides when to intervene? The principle could easily be abused by powerful nations as a pretext to invade weaker nations for their own strategic or economic interests, all under the noble banner of humanitarianism. It could undermine the entire international system of state sovereignty, leading to a world of constant, chaotic warfare. The dilemma is a tragic and profound one. It pits our moral revulsion to genocide against the very real and devastating risks of war. To intervene is to risk creating a bigger catastrophe. To not intervene is to allow a current catastrophe to continue. There is no clean, safe, or guaranteed right answer. The choice made by the international community in such a moment is a testament to the agonizing, high-stakes nature of global ethics, where every possible path is fraught with peril. The dilemma of intervention on Earth is complex. As humanity looks to the stars, a new set of pioneering dilemmas is beginning to emerge.
Chapter 26: The Ethics of Space Colonization. The dilemma of humanitarian intervention is about our right to cross borders on Earth. We now turn our gaze upward to a new frontier that raises unprecedented ethical questions about our right to cross the ultimate border and to colonize other worlds. This is the emergent dilemma of space colonization. Let us imagine that humanity has developed the technology to establish a self-sustaining colony on Mars. The arguments for pursuing this goal are powerful and deeply ingrained in our exploratory spirit. Proponents, from scientists to entrepreneurs, argue that becoming a multiplanetary species is a moral imperative. It is the ultimate insurance policy against the existential risks that threaten humanity on Earth, such as a supervolcano, an asteroid impact, or a self-inflicted nuclear or environmental catastrophe. To remain on one planet is to keep all of our eggs in one very fragile basket. Colonizing Mars, in this view, is the most important project we can undertake to ensure the long-term survival of human consciousness. Furthermore, the endeavor would be a powerful engine for scientific and technological progress, inspiring a new generation and uniting humanity in a shared, noble goal. It is the ultimate expression of the human drive to explore, to overcome challenges, and to secure our future. The ethical objections to space colonization, however, are also profound. The first is a question of priorities. At a time when we are facing urgent existential crises right here on Earth, climate change, poverty, disease, is it ethically justifiable to spend trillions of dollars on establishing a colony for a tiny elite on another planet? Critics would argue that this is the ultimate act of escapism, a fantasy of the ultra-wealthy to flee the problems of Earth rather than staying and solving them. The money and scientific talent dedicated to colonizing Mars could, they argue, be used to save millions of lives and to restore the health of our own planet. The second, more philosophical objection arises from the question of what we might find on Mars. Suppose we discover that Mars is not a dead planet, but harbors its own unique microbial life forms deep beneath the surface. What right do we, as alien invaders, have to introduce our own terrestrial biology and our industrial processes
into this pristine ecosystem. The arrival of humans could be an extinction-level event for any native Martian life. Do we have the right to contaminate and potentially destroy another world's biosphere for our own benefit? This forces us to consider a form of planetary environmental ethics. The dilemma is a conflict between two different visions of humanity's future. One is an outward-looking expansionist vision that prioritizes the long-term survival of our species. The other is an inward-looking conservationist vision that prioritizes our responsibility to solve our problems on Earth and to respect any other life we may find in the cosmos. The choice of whether to become cosmic pioneers or terrestrial stewards is a defining one for the future of our species. This dilemma is about a potential future conflict. But what about the ethics of starting a very real conflict, not because we have been attacked, but because we fear we might be?
Chapter 27: Preemptive War. The ethics of space colonization is a dilemma about our expansion into new territories. We now return to Earth, to one of the most dangerous and controversial dilemmas in international relations: the ethics of launching a preemptive war. Let us imagine a scenario between two nations, Nation A and Nation B. Nation A is a stable democracy. Nation B is a hostile, authoritarian regime with a history of aggression. The intelligence agencies of Nation A gather what they believe is credible and alarming evidence. Nation B is secretly developing nuclear weapons and is just months away from having a functional bomb. The leaders of Nation A believe that if Nation B acquires nuclear weapons, it will use them, either directly or to blackmail its neighbors, leading to a catastrophic war. They are faced with a stark and terrifying choice. The first option is to launch a preemptive military strike. This would involve a targeted attack on Nation B's nuclear facilities to destroy them before they can become operational. The argument for this is rooted in a principle of self-defense and the lesser of two evils. Proponents would argue that it is better to fight a smaller, conventional war now than a devastating nuclear war later. To wait until the threat is fully realized would be a catastrophic failure of leadership. The primary duty of a state is to protect its own citizens, and a preemptive strike, while a grave act, is the only responsible way to eliminate an existential threat before it can be used. It is a pragmatic, if brutal, calculation designed to prevent a much greater future tragedy. The ethical arguments against a preemptive war, however, are incredibly powerful. The first and most obvious is that it is an act of aggression. Nation B has not yet attacked Nation A. To launch a strike is to be the aggressor, to fire the first shot. This violates the foundational principles of international law, which generally prohibit the use of force except in cases of clear self-defense against an actual or imminent attack. It could set a dangerous precedent, creating a world where any nation can attack another based on a perceived future threat. The second major objection is the problem of uncertainty. Intelligence is rarely perfect. What if the evidence is wrong? What if Nation B is not as close to developing a weapon as believed? To launch a war based on flawed intelligence would be a tragic and unforgivable mistake, an act of aggression that would kill thousands of people for no reason. Finally, a preemptive strike could backfire, sparking the very regional conflagration it was designed to prevent.
The dilemma is a terrifying one. It pits the responsibility of a leader to protect their people from a future threat against the profound moral and legal prohibitions against starting a war. It is a choice made in a fog of uncertainty, where the consequences of either action or inaction could be catastrophic. The decision to go to war is the most momentous a leader can make. A more common and more subtle tool of international coercion is the use of economic sanctions, which carries its own profound ethical weight.
Chapter 28: International Sanctions. The dilemma of preemptive war is about the use of direct violent force. We now turn to a more indirect, but still deeply harmful tool of international policy: the ethics of imposing broad economic sanctions on another nation. Let us imagine a small authoritarian country ruled by a brutal dictator. The regime is violating the human rights of its citizens and is pursuing a foreign policy that destabilizes its neighbors. A coalition of powerful democratic nations decides to take action, but they wish to avoid a military conflict. Instead, they impose a comprehensive package of economic sanctions. These sanctions are designed to cripple the country's economy. They freeze the regime's assets abroad, prohibit international trade, and cut the country off from the global financial system. The argument for these sanctions is rooted in a desire to change the regime's behavior without resorting to war. Proponents argue that by inflicting severe economic pain, the sanctions will achieve two goals. First, they will deprive the regime of the resources it needs to fund its military and its oppressive internal security forces. Second, they will create widespread discontent among the country's population, who will, in theory, rise up and demand political change, or even overthrow the dictator. The sanctions are seen as a powerful, non-violent tool for applying pressure and promoting democracy. It is a path that seems more ethical and less costly than a military invasion. The ethical objections to broad economic sanctions, however, are profound and focus on the question of who actually suffers. Critics argue that the sanctions rarely harm the intended targets, the dictator and the ruling elite. The regime's leaders have a firm grip on power and will always find ways to enrich themselves and to acquire the resources they need, often through black markets and smuggling. The people who bear the brunt of the economic pain are the ordinary, innocent citizens of the country. The sanctions cause massive unemployment, hyperinflation, and shortages of essential goods like food and medicine. It is the poor, the sick, and the children who suffer and die from the effects of the sanctions, not the dictator. From this perspective, broad economic sanctions are a cruel and deeply unethical form of collective punishment. They punish the victims of the regime in the vain hope of somehow hurting the oppressors. Critics argue that this not only fails to achieve its goals, as the suffering population often rallies around the regime in a show of nationalist defiance, but it is also a moral failure, a decision to deliberately cause harm to innocent people as a means to a political end. The dilemma is a conflict between a desirable goal, toppling a dictatorship without war, and a method that causes immense collateral damage to the very people one is supposedly trying to help. It forces us to ask, is it ever ethical to intentionally harm an innocent population in the hope of achieving a greater political good? The way the international community answers this question reveals a great deal about its commitment to human rights in practice, not just in theory. The ethics of international pressure are complex. A related challenge involves not political pressure, but a cultural one: the question of whether a nation has the right to reclaim its historical treasures from the museums of the world.
Chapter 29: Returning Cultural Artifacts. The dilemma of international sanctions is about the ownership of a nation's economic future. We now turn to a dilemma about the ownership of a nation's cultural past. This is the passionate and politically charged debate over whether Western museums should return cultural artifacts to their countries of origin. Let us imagine the British Museum in London. One of its most famous exhibits is the Parthenon marbles, a collection of classical Greek sculptures that were removed from the Acropolis in Athens in the early 19th century by a British nobleman, Lord Elgin. The government of Greece has formally and repeatedly requested that the sculptures be returned to Athens, arguing that they are a fundamental part of their national heritage and identity. The museum has consistently refused. The ethical argument for returning the artifacts is rooted in principles of national identity, cultural property, and restorative justice. The Greek government and its supporters argue that the sculptures are not just beautiful objects, they are a sacred symbol of their nation's history and cultural achievements. They were created in Greece, for Greece. To see them displayed in a foreign museum is a constant, painful reminder of a time when their nation was under foreign domination and its treasures could be plundered. They argue that the marbles were taken under legally and ethically questionable circumstances, and that the only moral course of action is to return them to their rightful home in Athens, where they can be displayed in a modern museum with a direct view of the Parthenon itself. This is an argument for cultural reunification. The ethical arguments for keeping the artifacts in the British Museum are also complex and are based on principles of universal access, preservation, and the very concept of a world museum. The museum's trustees argue that they are not just a British institution, but a global one. The Parthenon marbles, they contend, are part of the shared heritage of all humanity, not just Greece. In London, they can be seen by a vast international audience of millions of people from all over the world, promoting a universal appreciation for human culture. This is the encyclopedic museum argument. Furthermore, they argue that they have preserved the sculptures safely for over 200 years and that their state-of-the-art facility is the best place to ensure their continued conservation. Finally, they warn of a slippery slope. If they return the Parthenon marbles, would they not be obligated to return thousands of other objects, from Egyptian mummies to Assyrian reliefs, effectively emptying the great museums of the world? The dilemma is a profound one. It pits the passionate nationalist claim of a country to its own heritage against the universalist cosmopolitan ideal of a shared human culture. It forces us to ask, who is the rightful owner of the past? Do ancient artifacts belong to the modern nation-states that now occupy the land where they were created, or do they belong to all of humanity? The way we answer this question will define the future of our great cultural institutions and our understanding of the relationship between culture, identity, and ownership. This dilemma is about people who have a home but want their artifacts back. A far more urgent dilemma concerns people who have lost their homes and are simply seeking a place of refuge. Chapter 30: Climate Change Refugees. The dilemma of returning cultural artifacts is about the movement of objects across borders. We now turn to a far more urgent and tragic dilemma about the movement of people across borders, not for opportunity, but for survival. This is the looming ethical crisis of climate change refugees. Let us imagine a small, low-lying island nation in the Pacific. For generations, its people have lived in harmony with the sea. But now, due to global climate change, caused primarily by the emissions of large industrialized nations, the sea level is rising. Their ancestral homeland is disappearing. Salt water is contaminating their freshwater supplies, and storms are becoming more frequent and devastating.
It is a scientific certainty that within the next few decades, their entire nation will be underwater and uninhabitable. The nation's people are about to become a new kind of refugee, displaced not by war or persecution, but by a slow-motion environmental catastrophe. They will have no country to return to. They now petition the wealthy, high-emitting nations that are largely responsible for climate change, countries like the United States, China, and the nations of Europe, to grant their entire population a right to resettle. The ethical argument for accepting these refugees is rooted in a powerful principle of corrective justice. Proponents would argue that this is not a matter of charity, but of responsibility. The wealthy nations, through their historical and ongoing greenhouse gas emissions, have effectively caused the destruction of the island nation. They have a direct moral obligation to provide a new home for the people they have displaced. To turn them away would be a profound act of injustice, a refusal to take responsibility for the direct human consequences of one's own actions. It is an argument that the polluter must pay, and in this case, the payment is a place of refuge. The ethical arguments against this, or at least the political and practical challenges, are also significant. Opponents and skeptics in the wealthy nations might argue that while the plight of the islanders is tragic, their own nations are not solely responsible. Climate change is a global problem with many contributing countries. They might also raise concerns about the practicalities of resettling an entire population. Where would they live? Who would pay for their housing, their health care, their job training? They might argue that their own countries are already dealing with their own economic and social problems, and that they do not have the capacity to absorb tens of thousands of new migrants. This could lead to a political backlash from their own citizens, who might feel that their government is prioritizing foreigners over its own people. The dilemma is a stark and defining one for the 21st century. It pits the clear moral responsibility for a problem one has caused against the powerful forces of national self-interest and political pragmatism. It forces us to ask, what are the duties of the nations that have caused the climate crisis to the nations that are its first and most vulnerable victims? The way the international community answers this question will be a profound test of its commitment to climate justice and its capacity for compassion in the face of an unprecedented global crisis. This is a dilemma about global responsibility for the climate. A related dilemma concerns the global responsibility for health, particularly when it comes to the intellectual property of life-saving medicines.
Chapter 31: Intellectual Property versus Global Health. The dilemma of climate refugees is about a nation's responsibility for the physical displacement of a people. We now turn to a dilemma that is about a corporation's responsibility for the health of a people. A conflict that pits the right to a profit against the right to a life. This is the profound ethical clash between intellectual property rights and global public health. Let us imagine a large, innovative pharmaceutical company based in a wealthy, developed nation. After years of research and billions of dollars in investment, they have developed a new, revolutionary drug that cures a deadly disease, such as a new strain of HIV or a form of cancer. They patent the drug, which gives them the exclusive right to manufacture and sell it for the next 20 years. To recoup their massive research and development costs and to fund future innovation, they set a high price for the drug. The price is affordable for patients in wealthy countries with good health insurance, but it is catastrophically out of reach for the millions of people in poor developing nations where the disease is most rampant.
The government of one of these poor nations, facing a massive public health crisis, decides to take a drastic step. They announce their intention to break the patent, an act known as compulsory licensing. This would allow them to either import or manufacture a cheap, generic version of the drug to distribute to their suffering population, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. The pharmaceutical company is now at the center of a major ethical and legal battle. The argument for protecting the patent is rooted in the principles of intellectual property and the logic of innovation. The company would argue that the patent is the very engine of medical progress. Without the promise of a temporary monopoly and the ability to make a profit, companies would have no incentive to invest the vast sums of money and take the immense risks required to develop new life-saving drugs. To allow poor countries to simply break patents whenever they want would be to destroy this incentive system. It might save lives in the short term, but in the long term, it would stifle innovation and lead to a world with fewer new cures for everyone. This is the path of upholding the system of intellectual property. The ethical argument for breaking the patent, however, is a powerful and deeply compassionate one. Proponents would argue that when a patent stands in the way of saving millions of human lives, the right to a profit becomes secondary to the fundamental right to life and health. It is, they would argue, a monstrous moral failure for a society to possess the cure for a deadly disease, but to allow millions to die simply because they cannot afford it. From this perspective, a life-saving medicine is not a mere commodity, like a luxury car or a designer handbag. It is a fundamental human good. To allow a company to hoard a cure for profit in the face of a global health crisis is to place corporate greed above human life. The dilemma is a stark conflict between two competing goods: the good of an innovation system that produces new cures, and the good of providing existing cures to everyone who needs them, regardless of their ability to pay. It forces us to ask a fundamental question. Does a company have a moral right to profit from a life-saving invention, even if that profit comes at the cost of human lives? The way the global community resolves this tension between the market and morality will have life and death consequences for millions of people. This dilemma is about the gap in access to medicine. An even larger, more foundational dilemma concerns the gap in access to wealth itself.
Chapter 32: The Global Wealth Gap. The dilemma between intellectual property and global health is a specific manifestation of a much larger, more foundational ethical problem. The extreme and persistent gap in wealth between the developed nations of the global north and the developing nations of the global south. Let us step back and observe the world from a planetary perspective. We see a world of staggering contrasts. In one part of the world, a person might worry about which of their several investment properties to sell. In another part, a person might worry about whether their children will have enough food to survive the week. This vast chasm of inequality is not an accident of nature. It is the result of a long and complex history of colonialism, exploitation, and global economic structures that have systematically favored the wealthy nations. The ethical dilemma for the citizens and governments of the wealthy global north is, what, if anything, is our moral obligation to the billions of people living in extreme poverty in the global south? The first perspective is one of limited or charitable obligation. This view, common in wealthy nations, holds that while the poverty in the global south is tragic, it is not their direct responsibility to solve it. They may feel a charitable impulse to donate a small portion of their income to aid organizations, and their governments may allocate a small percentage of their budget
to foreign aid. But they do not see a fundamental duty of justice. They might argue that their own wealth was earned through their own nation's hard work, innovation, and good governance, and that they have a primary responsibility to their own citizens. From this perspective, foreign aid is a matter of optional generosity, not a moral imperative. The other, more radical ethical perspective is one of a profound and binding duty of justice. This view, articulated by philosophers like Peter Singer, argues that if we can prevent something terrible from happening at a small cost to ourselves, we have a moral obligation to do so. A person in a wealthy nation who spends $20 on a movie ticket could have instead used that money to provide a life-saving malaria net for a family in Africa. From this utilitarian perspective, to not do so is a moral failure. This view also argues that the wealth of the North was not created in a vacuum. It was built on a history of resource extraction and exploitation of the South. Therefore, the transfer of wealth is not an act of charity, but a matter of restorative justice, a repayment of a historical debt. This argument would call for a massive, systematic transfer of wealth from rich nations to poor ones on a scale that would likely require a significant reduction in the standard of living for people in the developed world. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits our natural inclination to prioritize our own, our families, and our nation's well-being against the demanding and universalist ethical logic that sees all human lives as being of equal moral worth. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be a good person in a world of extreme inequality? Is it enough to be kind to those around us and to not cause direct harm? Or do we have an active, positive duty to help those who are suffering, no matter how far away they may be? The way we, as individuals and as nations, answer this question is one of the most defining moral choices of our time. This marks the end of our exploration of the dilemmas of the global web. We now pivot to our fifth uncharted territory, a realm that deals not with wealth or power, but with the very nature of truth itself.
Chapter 33. Absolute Free Speech. We have concluded our exploration of the dilemmas that define our interconnected world. We now enter our fifth uncharted territory, a landscape of profound conflict over the nature of truth, knowledge, and expression. We begin with one of the most foundational and fiercely debated principles of a free society, the limits, if any, of free speech. Let us imagine a public university, a traditional bastion of open inquiry and debate. The university is considering a new policy on speech. One faction argues for a position of absolute free speech. Their argument is rooted in the classic liberal tradition of thinkers like John Stuart Mill. They contend that the only way for a society to arrive at the truth is for all ideas, without exception, to be allowed to compete in the marketplace of ideas. This includes ideas that are offensive, hateful, or demonstrably false. To suppress any speech, they argue, is to claim an infallible knowledge of what is true and what is false, a dangerous position for any institution to take. The proper response to bad speech in this view is not censorship, but more speech, to counter the hateful argument with a better, more reasoned one. This is the only way to build a society that is resilient, critical, and capable of genuine intellectual progress. To protect the speech we hate is the ultimate test of our commitment to freedom. The other faction argues that this absolutist position is a dangerous and outdated fantasy. They contend that certain types of speech are not contributions to a debate. They are acts of verbal violence that cause real, demonstrable harm. They argue that hate speech, for example, does not seek to persuade, it seeks to intimidate,
to silence and to dehumanize marginalized groups, making it impossible for them to participate as equals in the university community. To allow a white supremacist to speak on campus in this view is not a brave act of intellectual openness. It is a betrayal of the university's duty to provide a safe and inclusive learning environment for its minority students. They argue that a just society must draw a line and refuse to protect speech that is fundamentally aimed at harming others. This is the path of prioritizing safety and dignity over absolute freedom of expression. The dilemma is a profound and seemingly irreconcilable one. It pits two fundamental liberal values against each other: the value of free expression and the value of an inclusive, safe society. It forces us to ask a series of incredibly difficult questions. Is there a meaningful difference between physical harm and emotional or psychological harm? Who gets to decide what speech is hateful or harmful? And if we start to censor speech, is there a logical stopping point, or does it inevitably lead to the suppression of all dissent? The way a society navigates this conflict between free speech and the right to safety is one of the most defining challenges of our polarized and digitally amplified age. The question of what speech to allow is complex. A related and very modern question is whether private companies should be the ones making that decision.
Chapter 34: The Ethics of Deplatforming. The dilemma of absolute free speech is about what principles a society or an institution should hold. We now turn to a more practical and uniquely modern dilemma. Who has the power to enforce these principles in the digital age? This is the ethically charged issue of deplatforming. Let us imagine a highly popular social media platform, a private corporation that functions as the de facto public square for hundreds of millions of people. A very influential user on this platform has been consistently spreading dangerous misinformation. It might be a conspiracy theorist spreading false information about public health, or a political commentator inciting violence against a minority group. The social media company is now under immense public pressure to take action. They have a choice. The first option is to deplatform the user. This would involve permanently banning their account, effectively removing them from this massive digital public square and dramatically reducing their ability to spread their harmful message. The argument for this is rooted in a sense of corporate and social responsibility. The company would argue that their platform is their private property, and they have no obligation to host speech that violates their terms of service and causes real-world harm. They are not a government bound by the First Amendment. They are a private entity with the right to curate their own community. To allow their platform to be used to spread dangerous lies or to incite violence would be to be a passive accomplice to that harm. Deplatforming, in this view, is a necessary act of corporate hygiene, a way of protecting their user base and the public good. The ethical arguments against deplatforming, however, are also very powerful. Critics would argue that these social media giants are no longer just private companies. They have become an essential part of the public infrastructure for communication. To be banned from a major platform is to be effectively silenced in the modern world. They argue that giving a handful of unelected tech executives in Silicon Valley the power to decide what speech is acceptable and who gets to participate in the public debate is a dangerous and unaccountable form of power. This creates a new form of corporate censorship that is arguably more powerful than government censorship. Who holds these companies accountable? What are their biases? The process is often opaque, with no clear appeals process. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits our desire to stop the spread of harmful misinformation
against our fear of a new, unaccountable form of corporate censorship. It forces us to ask, in the digital age, who should be the ultimate arbiter of acceptable speech? Should it be the government with its legal frameworks and potential for tyranny? Or should it be private corporations with their terms of service and potential for arbitrary, profit-driven decisions? We have created a new public square, but we have not yet figured out what the rules are or who the referees should be. The question of what ideas are allowed in the public square is central here. An even more radical question is whether there are some ideas, some forms of knowledge that humanity should be forbidden from ever pursuing at all.
Chapter 35: Forbidden Knowledge. The dilemma of deplatforming is about whether to suppress existing knowledge or speech. We now venture into a more speculative and chilling territory. The question of whether there are certain types of knowledge that are so dangerous that humanity should make a collective, ethical decision to never pursue them. This is the dilemma of forbidden knowledge. Let us imagine the global scientific community. It is generally guided by a deep and powerful ethos of free inquiry, that all knowledge is worth pursuing, and that the pursuit of truth is one of humanity's noblest endeavors. However, a group of prominent scientists and ethicists raises an alarm. They propose that there are certain information hazards, certain pieces of knowledge that, if discovered and disseminated, would pose an existential risk to the future of humanity. They are not talking about knowledge that is merely offensive, but knowledge that could be weaponized on a global scale. For example, what if a team of geneticists discovers the precise genetic sequence that could be used to create an airborne, highly contagious, and 100% fatal virus? What if a physicist, exploring the nature of the vacuum, discovers a theoretical way to trigger a vacuum decay event that could destroy the entire universe? The argument for forbidding this research is a straightforward one, based on the principle of existential safety. Proponents would argue that our technological power has outpaced our moral wisdom. We now have the ability to discover knowledge that we are not mature enough to handle. The potential benefit of knowing how to create a doomsday virus is infinitesimally small compared to the catastrophic risk of that knowledge falling into the wrong hands. Therefore, they argue, the global scientific community must establish a new ethical taboo. They must create a new category of forbidden research, areas of inquiry that are deemed too dangerous to ever explore. It is an argument for a willed and collective ignorance, a choice to leave certain doors of knowledge permanently sealed for the sake of survival. The ethical arguments against this are also deeply powerful and are rooted in the very spirit of the Enlightenment. Opponents would argue that the very concept of forbidden knowledge is anathema to a free and rational society. Who gets to decide what is too dangerous to know? Such a system could easily be abused by governments or religious authorities to suppress any research that challenges their power or their dogma. Furthermore, they would argue that you cannot stop the pursuit of knowledge. If one country forbids the research, another, more reckless country will pursue it in secret. The only way to defend against a dangerous new technology is to understand it better than your adversaries. The path to safety, in this view, is not through ignorance, but through more knowledge and through the open, collaborative development of defensive measures. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits our primal instinct for survival against our deepest intellectual commitment to free inquiry. It forces us to ask, is all knowledge good? Or have we reached a point in our evolution where our capacity for discovery has become our greatest threat? The choice to create a list of forbidden questions would be a fundamental turning point in the history of human thought. This dilemma is about knowledge that is so dangerous it could harm humanity. A related but more personal dilemma concerns knowledge that is gained by harming individuals, as we now explore the ethics of deception in psychological research.
Chapter 36: The Use of Deception in Psychological Research. The dilemma of forbidden knowledge is about protecting humanity from the potential consequences of a discovery. We now narrow our focus to a dilemma about protecting individuals from the process of discovery itself. This is the classic and deeply contentious ethical issue of using deception in psychological research. Let us imagine a team of university psychologists who want to study the nature of conformity. They design an experiment to test whether a person will ignore the evidence of their own senses in order to fit in with a group. The experiment is set up as a simple vision test. A single real participant is placed in a room with a group of other participants, who are in reality actors hired by the researchers. The group is shown a series of lines and is asked to identify which ones are the same length. The task is incredibly easy. However, the actors have all been instructed to unanimously give the same, obviously incorrect answer. The real participant is now in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Their own eyes are telling them one thing, but the entire group around them is confidently saying the opposite. The experiment is designed to see if they will abandon their own correct judgment in order to conform with the group. The argument for using this kind of deception is a utilitarian one. Proponents argue that it is the only way to study certain crucial aspects of human behavior. If the participant knew the true nature of the experiment, they would not act naturally. The very knowledge that they are being observed would contaminate the results. Deception, in this view, is a necessary tool to create a controlled environment where authentic human psychology can be observed. The knowledge gained from such experiments about conformity, obedience to authority, or the bystander effect is incredibly valuable to society. It helps us understand the psychological mechanisms that can lead to both good and evil. The ethical arguments against deception, however, are rooted in the principles of respect for persons and informed consent. Opponents argue to deceive a participant is to treat them as a means to an end, not as an autonomous individual. You are lying to them, and you are manipulating them into a situation that is often designed to be stressful and uncomfortable. This is a violation of the trust that should exist between a researcher and a participant. Furthermore, the experience of being deceived can be harmful to the participant. After the experiment is revealed, they might feel embarrassed, foolish, or cynical about psychological research in the future. It could lead to a lasting sense of mistrust. This is particularly true in more extreme experiments, like the famous Milgram experiment on obedience to authority, where participants were led to believe they were administering painful electric shocks to another person, causing them immense psychological distress. The dilemma is a conflict between the pursuit of valuable knowledge and the ethical treatment of the individuals who participate in that pursuit. It forces the scientific community to constantly weigh the potential benefits of a study against the potential harm to its participants. Modern research ethics boards have created strict guidelines to minimize this harm, requiring debriefing and ensuring that the deception is as minimal as possible. But the fundamental gray area remains.
When, if ever, is it ethical to lie to someone for the sake of a greater scientific truth? The ethics of deception in a controlled experiment are complex. They become even more so when a person must decide whether to deceive their own organization for the sake of a much larger public truth. Chapter 37: The Ethics of Whistleblowing on National Security. The dilemma of deception in research is about a professional lying to a subject. We now turn to a far more high-stakes dilemma where an individual must consider lying to and betraying their own organization. This is the profound and dangerous ethical choice of a national security whistleblower. Let us imagine an intelligence analyst, a woman named Sarah, working for a powerful government spy agency. She has signed a lifelong secrecy oath, a legally binding contract to never reveal the classified information she has access to. In the course of her work, she discovers a program that shocks her conscience. She finds undeniable proof that her own agency is conducting a massive, secret, and illegal surveillance program, spying on millions of its own citizens without a warrant in direct violation of the nation's constitution. She has tried to raise her concerns through the official internal channels, but she has been ignored and told to drop the matter. She is now at a monumental ethical crossroads. The path of loyalty and obedience is clear. She has a legal and contractual duty to remain silent. Her oath is a sacred promise. To leak the classified information would be to commit a serious crime, an act of espionage for which she could be imprisoned for the rest of her life. Furthermore, she recognizes that some of the information is genuinely sensitive. Its public release could compromise legitimate intelligence operations and potentially endanger the lives of her colleagues in the field. From this perspective, to remain silent is to honor her commitments and to protect the nation's security. The other path is one of a higher civic loyalty. Sarah believes that the government she serves is committing a profound and illegal betrayal of its own people. She feels that her ultimate duty is not to her agency, but to the Constitution and to the public. She believes that the public has a fundamental right to know that their own government is breaking the law and violating their rights. In her view, the illegal surveillance program is a far greater threat to the health of the democracy than the potential harm from her leak. The only way to stop this abusive power is to expose it to the light of day by leaking the documents to the press. This is the path of whistleblowing. The dilemma is a dramatic conflict between two different kinds of duty, a legal duty to an organization and a perceived moral duty to the public and to justice. To be a whistleblower is to sacrifice one's own career, freedom, and personal safety for the sake of a principle. It is an act of profound civil disobedience. There is no societal consensus on the figure of the whistleblower. To some, they are heroes, courageous patriots who risk everything to hold power accountable. To others, they are traitors, narcissistic criminals who betray their country and endanger national security. The choice Sarah must make is a lonely and terrifying one, a shade of gray where the line between hero and traitor is a matter of profound and deeply personal conviction. The whistleblower chooses to reveal a hidden truth. But what if the truth is not hidden, but is simply curated for us by invisible forces? We now turn to the dilemma of the algorithmic reality we all inhabit. Chapter 38: The Right to an Uncurated Reality. The dilemma of the whistleblower is about the active concealment of information. We now turn to a more passive but equally profound dilemma about the automated filtering of information. This is the ethical challenge of the filter bubble and our potential right to an uncurated reality. Let us imagine a typical internet user, David, in his daily life. He gets his news from his social media feed. He finds new music and movies through a recommendation engine. He searches for information on a search engine that personalizes his results. Without him being fully aware of it, his entire digital life is being curated by a series of complex algorithms. These algorithms are not designed to give him the most accurate or diverse view of the world. They are designed for one primary purpose: to keep him engaged. They do this by learning what he likes, what he agrees with, and what he fears, and then showing him more of the same. The result is that David is slowly and imperceptibly enclosed in a filter bubble. His social media feed becomes an echo chamber, filled only with news and opinions that confirm his existing beliefs. His search results prioritize information that aligns with his past search history. He is living in a personalized reality, a world that has been algorithmically tailored to his own biases. The ethical dilemma here is a subtle but profound one. On one hand, this personalization is a service. Proponents would argue that the internet is a vast and overwhelming place, and these algorithms are simply helpful tools that filter out the noise and show us what is most relevant to our interests. It is a form of customized convenience. If David likes a certain political viewpoint, why shouldn't his newsfeed show him more of that viewpoint? It is, in essence, giving the user what they want. The ethical argument against this, however, is that it is a profound threat to our ability to think critically and to function as citizens in a diverse democracy. By only showing us what we already agree with, the filter bubble prevents us from ever being challenged by opposing viewpoints. It makes us more polarized, more extreme, and less able to understand or empathize with people who think differently. It can also make us more susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy theories, as the algorithm learns our fears and feeds us a steady diet of content that confirms them. The dilemma forces us to ask, do we have a right to an uncurated reality? Do these massive tech platforms have an ethical obligation not just to give us what we want, but also to give us what we need: a diverse, challenging, and sometimes uncomfortable view of the world? The gray area is that we are, to some extent, willing participants in the creation of our own bubbles. The choice to actively seek out opposing viewpoints, to follow people we disagree with, or to use tools that are not personalized requires a conscious and difficult effort. The question of how we should see the world is intertwined with how we should see the past, as we now explore the contentious line between correcting and rewriting history.
Chapter 39: Historical Revisionism versus Correction. The dilemma of the filter bubble is about the curation of our present reality. We now turn to an equally contentious dilemma about the curation of our past reality. This is the fierce and ongoing debate over the line between a necessary correction of the historical record and a dangerous form of historical revisionism. Let us imagine a national history curriculum committee that is deciding how to teach the story of their nation's founding. The traditional, long-standing narrative has been a heroic one. It has focused on the bravery and wisdom of the nation's founders, celebrating them as champions of liberty and democracy. This narrative, however, largely ignores or downplays their darker aspects, such as the fact that many of them were slave owners and that the nation was founded on land taken from indigenous peoples. A new group of historians on the committee argues for a significant change.
They propose that the curriculum be updated to include these difficult and uncomfortable truths. Their argument is that the traditional narrative is not just incomplete, it is a form of propaganda that whitewashes the past. A true and honest history, they contend, must be a critical one. It must confront the nation's sins as well as its virtues. To do so is not to be unpatriotic, it is to engage in a more mature and honest form of patriotism, one that is strong enough to acknowledge the complexities and contradictions of its own history. This is the argument for historical correction. Another group on the committee, however, argues vehemently against this change. They see this new approach as a form of historical revisionism, driven by a modern political agenda to denigrate the nation and its heroes. They argue that while the founders may have been flawed by modern standards, they were men of their time, and they should be judged in that context. To focus on their sins is to miss the greatness of their achievements. They fear that this new critical narrative will teach a generation of children to be ashamed of their own country, to see its history only as a story of oppression. They argue for the importance of a unifying, inspirational national story that fosters a sense of shared pride and identity. This is the argument against what they see as a dangerous revisionism. The dilemma is a profound one. It forces us to ask, what is the purpose of history? Is it to construct a noble and unifying story that builds national pride? Or is it to pursue a complex, critical, and often painful truth in all its messiness? The line between correcting the record and revising it with a political agenda is often in the eye of the beholder. The choices this committee makes will shape the way an entire generation understands its own identity and its place in the world. This debate over how we frame the past is central to our culture. A related and very modern debate is about how we enforce social norms in the present, particularly through the tool of public shaming.
Chapter 40. Public Shaming as a Social Corrective. The dilemma of historical revisionism is about how we judge the figures of the past. We now turn to a dilemma about how we judge the figures of the present. This is the ethically complex and highly controversial use of public shaming, often through social media, as a tool for social correction. Let us imagine that a mid-level corporate executive is recorded on a cell phone video having a public, racially charged outburst in a coffee shop. The video is posted online and goes viral. Within hours, an online mob has identified the man, his employer, and his personal information. There is a massive public outcry. People flood his employer's social media with demands for him to be fired. They leave thousands of hateful comments on his own social media profiles. The shaming is intense, personal, and relentless. You, as an observer on social media, have a choice about whether to participate. The argument for participating in the public shaming is rooted in a sense of social justice and accountability. Proponents would argue that this is a new and powerful form of democratized justice. In the past, a person in a position of power could often get away with such behavior. Now, social media provides a tool for the public to hold them accountable. By participating in the outcry, you are adding your voice to a collective condemnation of racism. You are pressuring the corporation to take action and to make it clear that such behavior has professional consequences. From this perspective, public shaming is a necessary and effective tool
for enforcing social norms and for giving a voice to the marginalized. It is a way of saying this behavior is not acceptable in our society. The ethical arguments against this practice, however, are also very powerful. Opponents would argue that this is not justice, it is a form of mob rule, a digital witch hunt. The shaming is often wildly disproportionate to the original offense. The goal is often not just accountability, but the complete and total destruction of a person's life, their job, their reputation, their peace of mind. There is no due process, no context, no chance for apology or redemption. The online mob acts as judge, jury, and executioner. Furthermore, this practice can have a chilling effect on speech and expression, creating a culture of fear where anyone can be destroyed for a single out-of-context mistake. From this perspective, it is a toxic and cruel form of vigilantism that lacks the very principles of justice, proportionality, mercy, and due process that it claims to be serving. The dilemma is a conflict between our desire for a more just and accountable society and our commitment to the principles of due process and humane treatment, even for those who have transgressed. It forces us to ask, what is the difference between accountability and vengeance? And in our quest to enforce social norms, are we creating a new and more terrifying form of social control? This completes our exploration of the dilemmas of truth. We now pivot to our final uncharted territory, our complex and often contradictory relationship with the non-human world.
Chapter 41. The Abolition of Animal Farming. We have concluded our exploration of the dilemmas of truth and knowledge. We now enter our sixth and final uncharted territory, the complex and evolving relationship between humanity and the non-human world. We begin with a radical and profound ethical proposal that challenges one of the ancient and fundamental practices of human civilization, the complete abolition of animal farming. Let us imagine a society where the consumption of meat, dairy, and eggs is a central part of the culture and the economy. A new philosophical and social movement gains prominence, arguing for what they call animal abolitionism. Their argument is not a moderate call for better animal welfare, for bigger cages, or more humane slaughter. It is a radical, absolutist argument that all sentient beings, human or non-human, have a fundamental right to not be treated as the property or resource of others. The argument for this position, often rooted in the work of philosophers like Tom Regan, is based on the principle of inherent value. Proponents would argue that a pig, a cow, or a chicken is a subject of a life. It has its own desires, its own experiences, its own sense of the world. It is a conscious, feeling being. Therefore, to breed these animals for the sole purpose of killing them and consuming their bodies is a profound act of injustice, a form of tyranny of one species over another. They argue that our use of animals for food is not a necessity, but a choice, and it is a choice that is based on a morally indefensible prejudice called speciesism, the idea that the interests of our own species are inherently more important than the interests of other species. In their view, the industrial farming system is not just a source of suffering, it is a moral catastrophe, a holocaust that we inflict on billions of sentient beings every year. The only ethical response, they contend, is to abolish it entirely,
and to move to a completely plant-based food system. The ethical and practical arguments against this abolitionist stance are also incredibly powerful. The first is a traditional, hierarchical view of nature. Opponents would argue that the food chain is a natural part of life, and that humans, as the dominant species, have a natural right to use other animals for their sustenance. This has been the practice of nearly every human culture throughout history. To call it immoral is to reject a fundamental aspect of our own nature. The second objection is a pragmatic and economical one. The animal agriculture industry is a massive and integral part of the global economy. It provides a livelihood for billions of people, from small family farmers to workers in processing plants. To abolish it would cause an economic disruption of unimaginable proportions, destroying communities and upending the lives of a huge portion of the world's population. Finally, there are arguments about health and nutrition, with many believing that animal products are an essential part of a healthy human diet. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits a radical new vision of interspecies justice against the deeply entrenched traditions, economic realities, and biological assumptions of human civilization. It forces us to ask, what is our true place in the natural world? Are we its rightful masters, or are we just one species among many, with a moral obligation to respect the lives of other sentient beings? The choice to continue or to abolish animal farming is one of the most fundamental ethical questions we face as we reconsider our relationship with the planet. This dilemma is about the future of species that are currently abundant. A related and more technologically complex dilemma is about the past and whether we should bring back the species that are already gone.
Chapter 42. De-extinction, the revival of lost species. The dilemma of animal farming is about our responsibility to the species we dominate. We now turn to a dilemma about our responsibility to the species we have already destroyed. This is the scientifically plausible and ethically complex prospect of de-extinction, the use of genetic technology to revive extinct species. Let us imagine that scientists have successfully sequenced the complete genome of the woolly mammoth from DNA recovered from frozen carcasses in Siberia. Using a combination of cloning technology and an artificial womb, they now have the ability to bring a living, breathing woolly mammoth back into the world, tens of thousands of years after it disappeared. The arguments for pursuing this technology are powerful and based on a sense of restorative justice and scientific wonder. Proponents would argue that since human activity contributed to the extinction of many of these magnificent creatures, we have a moral obligation to bring them back if we can. De-extinction, in this view, is a way of correcting our past mistakes, of atoning for our ecological sins. It is an act of profound environmental stewardship. Furthermore, the revival of certain keystone species could have significant ecological benefits. Reintroducing mammoths to the Siberian tundra, for example, could help to restore the ancient grassland ecosystem, which could in turn help to combat climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil. Finally, there is the simple, powerful argument of human curiosity and wonder. Who would not want to see a living mammoth? It would be an incredible scientific achievement and a source of inspiration for all of humanity. The ethical arguments against de-extinction, however, are also very strong. The first
is a concern for the well-being of the revived animal. A single cloned mammoth would be born into a world it does not know, with no parents to teach it how to be a mammoth. It would be a lonely spectacle, a scientific curiosity destined to live its life in a zoo or a special enclosure. Is it ethical to bring a sentient being into existence for our own scientific or aesthetic purposes, knowing that it will never have a natural life? The second major objection is an ecological one. The world has changed dramatically since the last mammoths walked the earth. The ecosystems they inhabited are gone. To reintroduce them could have unpredictable and potentially disastrous consequences for the modern plants and animals that live there now. It could be the ultimate invasive species. Finally, critics warn that de-extinction is a dangerous distraction from the current extinction crisis. They fear that if the public believes we can simply bring species back from the dead, it will reduce the urgency of the hard, unglamorous work of protecting the species that are still alive today. Why worry about saving the last rhinos if we can just clone them back later? The dilemma is a conflict between our desire to fix the past and our responsibility to the present. It pits a powerful, redemptive, and scientifically exciting vision against a more cautious, conservation-minded approach. It forces us to ask, what is our proper role in the grand story of life on Earth? Are we merely curators of what remains? Or are we now becoming the authors of what was and what will be? The question of what rights to grant a revived species is profound. An even more radical idea is the question of whether to grant rights to the non-living natural world itself.
Chapter 43. Assigning Personhood to Natural Entities. The dilemma of de-extinction is about the moral status of individual revived animals. We now expand our view to consider a far more radical legal and ethical idea: the granting of legal personhood to entire ecosystems, such as rivers, forests, and mountains. Let us imagine a country whose legal system is considering a groundbreaking new law. The law would grant a major ancient river, which is currently suffering from severe pollution, the legal status of a person. This would mean that the river itself would have legal rights, just like a human being or a corporation. It would have the right to exist, to flow, to be free from pollution. It could sue in a court of law to protect itself. Of course, the river cannot speak for itself, so the law would appoint a board of human guardians composed of local indigenous leaders and environmental scientists to act as the river's legal representatives. The argument for this is rooted in a deep ecological and indigenous worldview. Proponents would argue that our current legal system, which treats nature as mere property to be owned and exploited, has failed to protect the environment. By granting personhood to a river, we would be fundamentally changing its status from an object to a subject. It would no longer be a resource to be used. It would be a living entity with an inherent right to its own health and integrity. This legal framework would provide a much more powerful tool for environmental protection. Instead of having to prove that pollution is harming a specific human interest, the river's guardians could sue a corporation simply by proving that it is harming the river itself. It is a revolutionary attempt to bring our legal system into alignment with the ecological truth that we are part of nature, not its masters. The ethical and legal objections to this idea are also significant. Critics would argue that this is a dangerous and absurd legal fiction. A river, they would contend, is not a person. It has no consciousness, no interests, no ability to feel. To grant it rights is to devalue the very concept of personhood, which should be reserved for beings with a certain level of sentience and rationality. They would also raise practical concerns. Who gets to be the voice of the river? The appointed guardians could easily abuse their position for their own political or financial gain, all under the guise of speaking for nature. Furthermore, where does this end? If we grant personhood to a river, should we also grant it to a forest, a mountain range, a bee colony? This could lead to a legal chaos that would paralyze all economic activity, as every development project could be challenged in court by the legal representatives of a local ecosystem. The dilemma is a fundamental conflict between two worldviews. One is the traditional Western view of nature as a resource for human use. The other is a more holistic, ecological, and indigenous view of nature as a community of living subjects, of which we are just one part. The choice to grant personhood to a river would be a monumental shift in our legal and ethical relationship with the non-human world. The ethics of how we treat entire ecosystems are vast. A more focused and equally contentious debate centers on how we treat individual animals that we have removed from those ecosystems, as we now explore the ethics of zoos. Chapter 44. The Ethics of Zoos and Aquariums. The dilemma of granting personhood to a river is about the rights of an entire ecosystem. We now narrow our focus to a dilemma about the rights of individual wild animals that we have placed in captivity for our own purposes. This is the enduring and deeply emotional ethical debate over the existence of zoos and aquariums. Let us imagine a modern, well-regarded city zoo. The enclosures are spacious and designed to mimic the animals' natural habitats. The animals are well-fed and receive excellent veterinary care. The zoo is a popular destination for families and school groups. The argument for the existence of such a zoo is a compelling one, based on three main pillars: conservation, education, and research. Proponents would argue that zoos are a vital arc for the preservation of endangered species. They run crucial breeding programs that can help to save species from the brink of extinction, with the ultimate goal of one day reintroducing them into protected areas in the wild. Secondly, they argue that zoos are a powerful tool for education. For most people living in cities, the zoo is the only place they will ever have the chance to see and connect with a living lion, an elephant, or a gorilla. This connection, they contend, fosters a lifelong appreciation for wildlife and a desire to support conservation efforts. Finally, zoos are important centers for scientific research, allowing us to study animal biology and behavior in ways that would be impossible in the wild. This is the argument for the zoo as a necessary and benevolent institution. The ethical arguments against zoos, however, are equally powerful and are rooted in the principle of animal liberty. Opponents would argue that no matter how well designed the enclosure, a zoo is fundamentally a prison. To take a wild, intelligent, and far-ranging animal like a tiger or an orca and to confine it to a tiny fraction of its natural territory for its entire life is an act of profound cruelty. They argue that this confinement leads to immense psychological suffering, a condition known as zoochosis, which manifests in abnormal behaviors like repetitive pacing or self-harm. They would also challenge the effectiveness of the zoo's conservation and education claims. They might point out that only a tiny fraction of zoo animals are ever successfully reintroduced to the wild,
and that seeing an animal in an artificial environment does not necessarily translate into meaningful conservation action. From this perspective, a zoo is not an ark. It is a collection of living exhibits, a spectacle designed for human entertainment at the cost of animal freedom. The dilemma is a conflict between the collective good of a species, conservation, and the individual right of a sentient being to liberty. It pits the potential benefits of education and research against the certain cost of lifelong confinement. It forces us to ask, do we have the right to imprison one animal for the supposed benefit of its entire species or for the education of our own? The way we answer this question reveals our fundamental beliefs about the value of animal freedom and the justification for animal captivity. This dilemma is about the animals we choose to keep in captivity. An even more pragmatic and difficult dilemma arises when we are forced to choose which animals in the wild we should even try to save.
Chapter 45. Conservation Triage, Prioritizing Species. The debate over zoos is about the ethics of captivity. We now turn to the wild, to a far more pragmatic and agonizing dilemma that conservationists face every day. This is the challenge of conservation triage, the necessity of choosing which endangered species to save when we do not have the resources to save them all. Let us imagine a major international conservation organization with a limited annual budget. They must decide where to allocate their funds for the coming year. They have two major projects on the table, but they only have the budget to fund one of them. The first project is a high-profile campaign to save the giant panda. Pandas are what is known as a charismatic megafauna. They are beloved by the public, and a campaign to save them is almost guaranteed to be a fundraising success. Protecting the panda's habitat in China would also indirectly protect many other less cute species that live in the same ecosystem. However, pandas are an evolutionary dead end. They are notoriously difficult to breed, and the specific bamboo forests they depend on are shrinking. The chances of their long-term survival in the wild, even with massive investment, are slim. The second project is a less glamorous, but perhaps more impactful, campaign to protect a species of frog that lives in a remote, threatened wetland. This frog is not cute or charismatic. The public has never heard of it, and a fundraising campaign for it would likely fail. However, this frog is a critical indicator species. Its health is a direct reflection of the health of its entire wetland ecosystem, which purifies water for millions of people and provides a habitat for thousands of other species. Saving the frog and its wetland would have a much larger and more significant ecological return on investment, but it lacks the public appeal of the panda. The conservation organization is now in a state of ethical and strategic triage. The argument for funding the panda project is a pragmatic, public relations-based one. The panda is a powerful spokes-animal for the entire conservation movement. The public's emotional connection to the panda can be leveraged to raise a huge amount of money, a portion of which can be used to fund other, less popular projects. To save the panda is to save the brand of conservation itself. The ethical argument for funding the frog project is a purely scientific and utilitarian one. It is about achieving the greatest possible ecological good with a limited amount of money. From this perspective, the emotional appeal of the panda is an irrational distraction. The primary duty of a conservation organization
is to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem function in the most efficient way possible. To fund the panda over the frog would be to choose a charismatic but inefficient symbol over a less attractive but more ecologically vital species. The dilemma is a conflict between the heart and the head. It pits the emotional public relations power of a beloved icon against the cold, rational calculus of ecological impact. It forces conservationists to make heartbreaking choices. Do we save the species that the public loves, or the species that the planet needs? The way we answer this question will determine the future of countless species and the very strategy of the global conservation movement. This dilemma is about how we allocate our resources to save nature. An even more complex dilemma arises when we consider destroying one part of nature in the hope of saving another.
Chapter 46: The Ethics of Deep-Sea Mining. The dilemma of conservation triage is about how to best use our limited resources to protect the natural world. We now turn to a dilemma where our desire to protect one part of the natural world, the climate, is in direct conflict with our desire to protect another, the last pristine, untouched ecosystem on Earth. This is the emerging ethical crisis of deep-sea mining. Let us imagine the global community in a desperate race to transition away from fossil fuels to a green, renewable energy economy. This transition requires a massive amount of specific minerals, cobalt, nickel, and manganese, which are essential components for electric vehicle batteries and other green technologies. The land-based mines for these minerals are often environmentally destructive and are plagued by a history of human rights abuses. A new and seemingly abundant source of these minerals has been discovered: potato-sized polymetallic nodules that lie scattered across the abyssal plains, the vast dark floor of the deep ocean. A coalition of corporations and governments proposes to begin a new industry: deep-sea mining. This would involve sending massive robotic harvesting machines to the ocean floor to collect these nodules. The argument for this is a powerful, climate-focused one. Proponents would argue that deep-sea mining is a necessary evil. We must have these minerals to build the green economy that will save us from catastrophic climate change. The deep sea, they would contend, is a vast, barren, and largely lifeless desert. The ecological damage from mining there would be far less than the damage from continuing to rely on fossil fuels or from opening new, destructive mines on land. It is a utilitarian argument that presents this as the least bad option, a difficult but necessary trade-off to save the global climate. The ethical arguments against deep-sea mining are rooted in a principle of precautionary stewardship and respect for the unknown. Opponents, primarily marine biologists and environmentalists, would argue that the deep sea is not a barren desert. It is the largest and least understood ecosystem on our planet, teeming with unique and often bizarre life forms that have evolved over millions of years in complete darkness. The mining process would be devastating. The robotic harvesters would scrape the ocean floor clean, destroying habitats that could take centuries to recover, if they ever do. They would also kick up massive plumes of sediment that could choke marine life over vast areas. To destroy this last, pristine wilderness, which we are only just beginning to explore, for our own short-term industrial needs, would be an act of unforgivable intergenerational vandalism. They argued that we should instead be focusing on recycling existing minerals and developing new battery technologies that do not rely on these rare metals. The dilemma is a profound one. It pits two competing environmental goods against each other, the good of a stable climate versus the good of a pristine deep-sea ecosystem. It forces us to ask, is it ever ethical to sacrifice one part of the natural world to save another? And do we have the right to exploit an environment that we do not even remotely understand? The choice we make will have consequences that will be written on the very floor of the ocean for millennia to come. The question of how we value nature is central here. A more fundamental question is whether nature has any value at all independent of us.
Chapter 47. The Value of Wilderness. The dilemma of deep-sea mining is a conflict between two different utilitarian values of nature. We now turn to a more fundamental, philosophical dilemma that underlies all of our environmental ethics. Does the natural world have an intrinsic value, independent of any benefit it provides to humans? Or is its value purely instrumental? Let us imagine a vast, remote, and breathtakingly beautiful mountain wilderness. It is pristine, untouched by human development. A proposal is put forward by a major corporation to build a new mine in the heart of this wilderness. The mine would extract a valuable mineral, create hundreds of jobs, and generate significant economic growth for the region. The environmental impact would be carefully managed, but the wilderness, as a pristine and untouched place, would be fundamentally and irreversibly changed. The debate over whether to approve the mine brings two opposing worldviews into sharp conflict. The first worldview is anthropocentric, or human-centered. This view argues that the natural world's value is purely instrumental. Its worth is determined by its usefulness to human beings. From this perspective, the mountain wilderness is a collection of resources. It has value as a source of minerals, as a place for human recreation, hiking, camping, or as a source of clean water. The decision of whether to build the mine is a simple cost-benefit analysis. Do the economic benefits of the mine outweigh the loss of the recreational and aesthetic benefits of the wilderness? If they do, then building the mine is the logical and ethical choice. In this view, nature exists for us. The other worldview is ecocentric, or ecosystem-centered. This view argues that the natural world has an intrinsic value. The mountain wilderness, in this view, has a right to exist for its own sake, independent of any value it may provide to humans. Its worth is not determined by its resources or its beauty as perceived by us. It has value simply because it is. The complex web of life, the ancient geological formations, the very wildness of the place, all of these have a moral standing on their own. From this perspective, to destroy the wilderness for a short-term human economic gain is a profound ethical failure, a violation of our duty to respect the non-human world. In this view, we are not the masters of nature, but merely one part of it. The dilemma is a fundamental one. It is not just about one mine in one mountain range. It is about the very foundation of our relationship with the planet. If nature only has instrumental value, then we are justified in managing and manipulating it for our own benefit. If it has intrinsic value, then we have a moral obligation to protect it, even when it is not in our direct economic self-interest to do so.
This is the philosophical divide that underlies almost all of our environmental debates. The choice between these two worldviews, the anthropocentric and the ecocentric, is one of the most significant ethical challenges of our time. This dilemma is about the value of the non-human world. The most delicate and controversial dilemma of all arises when we are forced to consider the size of the human world itself.
Chapter 48: Human Population and Planetary Boundaries. The dilemma of the value of wilderness is about our philosophical relationship with nature. We now arrive at the most sensitive, controversial, and perhaps most consequential dilemma in environmental ethics: the question of human population and its impact on the planet's ability to sustain life. Let us step back and view the Earth as a single, closed system. For the vast majority of human history, our population was a tiny fraction of what it is today. In the last 2 centuries, due to advances in medicine and agriculture, the human population has exploded, growing from 1 billion to over 8 billion people. This massive increase in our numbers, combined with our resource-intensive lifestyles, is placing an unprecedented and unsustainable strain on the planet's ecosystems. We are overdrawing on the Earth's finite resources, driving the climate crisis, and causing a mass extinction event. The ethical dilemma, though often considered too taboo to discuss openly, is this: do we, as a species, have an ethical responsibility to address the size of our own population for the sake of planetary health and the well-being of future generations? The argument for addressing population is a straightforward, if uncomfortable, mathematical one. Proponents would argue that we cannot solve our environmental crises through technology and efficiency alone if our population continues to grow exponentially. There is a finite limit to the number of people the Earth can sustainably support. To ignore the population factor is to ignore the root cause of the problem. They would argue that a responsible and ethical global policy would involve promoting universal access to education for women and girls, and universal access to voluntary family planning services, both of which have been proven to lead to lower fertility rates. This is not about coercion, they would insist, but about empowerment and choice. The ethical arguments against this, and the reasons the topic is so fraught, are powerful and deeply rooted in our most fundamental values. The first major objection is based on the principle of reproductive freedom. The decision of whether and when to have a child is one of the most personal and fundamental human rights. Any discussion of population control, even voluntary, can be seen as a slippery slope towards coercive and eugenicist policies, such as the one-child policy in China or the forced sterilizations that have occurred in some countries' histories. The second objection is that the problem is not population, but consumption. A single person in a wealthy, developed nation has a far greater environmental impact than a dozen people in a poor, developing one. Critics would argue that to focus on population, which is growing fastest in the poorest countries, is a way for the wealthy, over-consuming nations to shift the blame and to avoid addressing their own unsustainable lifestyles. The dilemma is a minefield of scientific data, ethical principles, and historical trauma. It pits the seemingly undeniable logic of planetary boundaries against the fundamental right to reproductive freedom and the complex politics of global inequality. To talk about population is to risk being accused of coercion and racism. To not talk about it is to risk ignoring one of the most critical factors in the long-term survival of our species. The way we navigate this incredibly sensitive conversation will be a test of our collective maturity and our ability to confront the most difficult truths about ourselves. The question of our impact on other species is central to this. An equally contentious and counterintuitive debate arises when we consider the practice of killing some animals in order to save them.
Chapter 49. Trophy Hunting for Conservation. The dilemma of human population is about our impact on the entire planetary system. We now narrow our focus to a specific and deeply counterintuitive dilemma in wildlife management. The argument that allowing wealthy foreigners to hunt endangered animals for sport can actually help to save the species. This is the paradoxical ethical debate over trophy hunting for conservation. Let us imagine a vast protected wildlife preserve in a poor African nation. The preserve is home to a struggling population of a critically endangered species, such as the black rhino. The government does not have enough money to fund the anti-poaching patrols and habitat management needed to protect the rhinos. The land is also coveted by local communities for farming and grazing. A controversial proposal is put forward. The government will auction off a permit to hunt and kill a single specific animal, an old post-reproductive male rhino that is known to be aggressive and is no longer contributing to the gene pool. The permit will be sold to a wealthy foreign trophy hunter for a massive sum, perhaps $500,000. The argument for this plan is a pragmatic utilitarian one. The conservation agency would argue that the $500,000 generated from this single hunt can be used to fund their entire anti-poaching operation for a full year, protecting the other 99 rhinos in the preserve. Furthermore, it gives the local community a direct economic incentive to protect the animals. The money can be used to build schools and clinics, making the rhinos more valuable to the community alive than dead to a poacher. From this perspective, the death of one carefully selected animal is a justifiable sacrifice for the greater good of saving the entire species. It is a choice to embrace a morally uncomfortable but practically effective solution. The ethical arguments against this are powerful and emotionally resonant. Opponents would argue that it is morally repugnant to turn a magnificent endangered creature into a commodity to be killed for sport. They would contend that all killing for pleasure is ethically wrong, and it is particularly perverse to apply it to a species on the brink of extinction. This practice, they argue, sends a confusing and contradictory message that it is wrong for a poor local poacher to kill a rhino, but it is acceptable for a wealthy foreigner to do so if they pay enough money. Furthermore, they worry that it creates a market that can be easily corrupted, with the money not actually going to conservation, or with officials taking bribes to allow the hunting of healthy, breeding animals. From this perspective, trophy hunting is a moral failure that undermines the very principle of respecting wildlife. The dilemma is a stark conflict between a cold, pragmatic calculus and a passionate, principled stance. It pits a strategy that may be effective in practice against a practice that feels deeply wrong in principle. It forces us to ask, can a morally questionable act be justified if it leads to a demonstrably good outcome? The choice to embrace or reject this controversial conservation tool is a testament to the complex and often paradoxical nature of our attempts to manage and protect the non-human world. We have now reached the end of our exploration of 50 uncharted dilemmas. All that remains is to reflect on the nature of the journey itself.
Chapter 50. The Courage of Not Knowing. We have reached the final waypoint in our long journey. We have stood on the frontiers of technology and wrestled with the specter of sentient AI and autonomous weapons. We have navigated the deeply personal and uncharted territories of bioethics, from designer babies to the very end of life. We have examined the architecture of our societies, confronting the ghosts of historical injustice and the paradoxes of our most cherished values. We have traversed a globe,
weighing our duties to each other in a world of profound inequality. And we have explored our complex and often contradictory relationship with the non-human world. We have stood at the edge of the map, and we have looked out into the vast, unknown expanse. What have we found here? We have found that the most significant ethical challenges of our time and of our future do not have easy answers. They are not simple problems awaiting a clever solution. They are dilemmas, profound and often tragic conflicts between deeply held values. They are clashes between freedom and security, between justice and mercy, between the rights of the individual and the good of the collective, between our duties to the present and our obligations to the future. To stand in this uncharted territory is to feel a sense of profound humility. It is to recognize the limits of our own knowledge and the inadequacy of our simple moral rules. The purpose of this journey was not to provide you with a new, more detailed map. It was to help you cultivate the skills of a navigator in a world where the map is constantly being redrawn. The most important of these skills is the courage to not know. It is the courage to resist the seductive pull of certainty, to reject the easy comfort of a simple black-and-white ideology. It is the ability to sit with the profound discomfort of a genuine dilemma, to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time, and to not rush to a premature judgment. It is the willingness to listen with genuine openness to the strongest arguments of those with whom you disagree. This is not a form of moral relativism or apathy. It is the very foundation of wisdom. True ethical maturity is not about having all the right answers. It is a relentless, humble, and compassionate engagement with the most difficult questions. The dilemmas we have explored are not just abstract thought experiments. They are the conversations that are happening right now in our laboratories, our legislatures, our courtrooms, and our homes. They are the choices that will shape the world our children will inherit. Our journey through the foundations of ethics and the challenges of its application is now complete. We are left, finally, with the most fundamental moral code of all. The moral systems and stories that humanity has told itself throughout history to make sense of this complex world. And it is to that final exploration that our journey will one day turn.